Good evening, everybody. Good evening, planning commissioners, council and staff, and all of our citizens who are here, and other individuals. So wanted to welcome everybody to our work session tonight. Vice Mayor Dave Snyder just emailed me. He's going to be a bit late due to a work issue that came up, so he should be joining us shortly. So why don't we go ahead and get started. We've got on the agenda tonight a joint work session with the Planning Commission. So we're going to take up several items, and then council is going to have its regular work session where we're going to deal with some budget issues and council comments. So without any further ado, Mr. Shields.
Thank you, Mayor Baruch, members of council, Chair Teets, and the members of the Planning Commission. I'm going to have Wendy Black-Sanford, the staff lead for the CACT and CIT, provide a staff report, and we're joined by the chair of the CACT, Mr. Paul Baldino, here at the table as well, and Bill Hicks, the city engineer who works with the CACT as well. But before getting into that, we have 3 items on the agenda listed with the joint session with the Planning Commission. Most of them are informational. We want to have input and feedback from the council as we're working through these policy changes.
That have amended that over time, and you're probably familiar with Spectrum and Byron, and we had some changes to those amendments in terms of the first floor retail the past few years. Most recently in 2009, Pearson Square, there was a pre-approved, let's call it non-retail, up to 8,000 square feet of the 19,000 square feet that exist in that building was pre-approved for non-retail use. And that was broken down in a couple categories, and the other part of that was any of that non-retail use could not have a lease more than 10 years. And so this applicant is looking to invest a lot of money in this space. They're looking for about 9,700 square feet. That represents half of the space in the first floor commercial area of Pearson Square. About 25% of it now is leased, Creative Cauldron, and there's a office user. And then if they were to move into this space, there still would be 25% left of the current space there vacant. And of those 2 spaces, one would be pretty much ideal for any kind of retail office, medical office use, and the other actually has vertical vents and is almost 3,000 square feet and could be a target for a nice restaurant. And so those would be the 2 vacant spaces post Body Dynamics if they were to move in here, as they have requested. The request before you is really just 2 parts. One is they want to occupy 9,700 approximately square feet. We're only pre-approved for about 8,000 of that to be non-retail, and we've classified them as a service use. And of that, the one tenant in there now, office, took up some of that 8,000. So what they're asking for is, to be exact, 2,968 square feet that's currently classified as retail only to be non-retail to go on top of that pre-approved 8,000. And so let's say 3,000 more square feet of the existing vacant space. And the space has been vacant, I think, for about 6 years now. The second part is because of the investment they want to make in this space, they were asking, in their case, to have a 20-year lease to help recoup that investment instead of the 10-year lease. So the request is as basic as that: 3,000 additional square feet of non-retail to accommodate their 9,700 and to have a 20-year versus a 10-year lease. Now, when I drafted up the resolution on that, I incorporated this in it, but I also thought about if you look at, this was one of your handouts, this shows all the space and the types of uses that Body Dynamics would take up within the building, which again I'll say is 50% of the space, total space. We also put together this exhibit that shows the entire building. If you look at that, it breaks it down, and it's just what I was saying is they're looking for 51%. The leased area is at around 22%, and the vacant left over, if they were to go in, would be about 26. So I was rounding earlier, for a total of 18,955 square feet. And so you can look here, and the yellow is what they would occupy. The pink is what's occupied now, and the green, which is what would be available in the future if they were to move into this facility. So having, broken this down, I was, having done this numerous times for numerous mixed-use projects, my thought was there's a 1,988 square foot space here that's in between Creative Cauldron and the current Edward Jones lease space in the green here. My thought was, and it was a question in the staff report, and it's really the question to you tonight, is to go ahead and pre-approve not only what they were asking, but an additional 2,000 square feet. So in other words, to accommodate them, we need to move the cap from 8,000 to 11,000. I'm proposing that you move it to 13. And that way you've pre-approved a little additional space, and we don't need to come back and do that. It still will allow for retail, medical office, restaurant, whatever they can get in it, but we don't have to keep coming back and doing this for small 2,000 square foot leftovers. You may just say, well, let's go ahead and hold off and let's leave 25% of it pure retail or restaurant space and let the market do its thing. And so that's sort of my thought to you is, I think this one space that's in the middle, that's 3,000 square feet, it's unit 110, it's got a vertical vent, it's ideal for a restaurant. We leave that as is, and hopefully they'll market it strongly along those lines. But this other space, we may want to pre-approve like we've done, so we don't have to keep going through this. But anyway, that's sort of my pitch to you. That was not their request, and so I'm looking for some feedback on that, and I'll adjust the ordinance however you feel on that. So as the manager had indicated, this was our work session to sort of introduce this for our future council agenda. We've tentatively scheduled it for the 28th in a week, with it going to the Planning Commission in December and boards and commissions in between, and back to you in middle of January for your final consideration. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to the applicant's agent and the applicant for a brief presentation, and then we'll go to questions. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Ben Danforth. I'm an attorney at Lawson, Tarter, and Charvet, and I'm here on behalf of Pearson Square. And with me is Jennifer Gamboa, and she's one of the co-owners of the business, along with her husband, Mario, who's also here today. He's out in the audience. As Mr. Fuller said, it's a pretty straightforward application. We just want to come in and try to get approval to have Body Dynamics come in and occupy the space. Right now, they're in Arlington on Wilson Boulevard, and their business is expanding, and their lease is coming to an end in Arlington, and they're looking at alternative locations, and they think that Pearson Square and the City of Falls Church would be an excellent location for their business as it continues to grow. I'm not going to go into the details of the square footage request, because Mr. Fuller covered that, and I'd be happy to talk about it some more if you have questions about it. But the big picture is what we're proposing to do here is bring in a business that's doing very well, and it would occupy a large amount of the currently vacant space within the building, and it's space that the property owners had a difficult time since the property was constructed about 5 years ago. They've had a difficult time filling that space. And I think one of the reasons is because it is on a secondary street. It's not on 29, it's not on 7. And a lot of retailers are reluctant to go into space on a secondary street, but it's the kind of space that a use like Body Dynamics would do very well in. Even though it is not considered or hasn't been determined to be the more traditional retail, we do feel like it has a lot of characteristics that's similar to traditional retail. And it's going to be a very active area. There's going to be a lot of windows along the front of the building. It's going to be very active inside the space. There's going to have classes and things like that that are going to be on the exterior of their space. So when people are walking by, they're going to see an active storefront or first floor. There's going to be an outdoor seating area out front of the building. So if parents are there and they're waiting for the kids to finish up a class, the parents can sit outside and talk and converse. They're also going to have some retail sales within the interior of the building. They'll probably be near the lobby area. And so if they finish up a class and they want to get an energy drink or some juice or something like that and just kind of cool down after their class, they can do that outside. We think there's a lot of good synergy with Creative Cauldron, which is in the first floor of the building as well. For example, one of the things that's been talked about is trying to schedule classes that that sync up well with what's going on at Creative Cauldron. So if, let's say, there's a children's class going on at Creative Cauldron, then Body Dynamics could have an adult class at the same time. So parents could come, drop their kids off for class, and then could do for a children's class at Creative Cauldron, and then could do an adult fitness class at Body Dynamics at the same time. As Mr. Fuller said, we're asking to amend the condition to go to allow the use to be there for 20 years, and the applicant, the property owner, and and Body Dynamics, they're going to put a lot of money into the space. They're looking at probably $1 million to $1.5 million in build out, and so it's going to take a while to recoup those costs, and that's the main reason why we're asking to go from 10 years to 20 years. We want to make it a really nice space, but then if you're going to spend money making it a nice space, then it just takes time to recoup those costs. So I'm going to turn over to Mrs. Gambo, and she's going to speak a little bit about the business and tell you about it.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I have to say thank you for letting us come and present to you all tonight. Mario and I have both been overwhelmed by the reception that we've received in Falls Church, so we really appreciate just the friendliness and how helpful you all have been with guiding us through this process. We are very excited about the possibility of coming into Falls Church. We've been in Arlington for 10 years. We've had significant growth and steady growth over each of those 10 years, and we're now really busting out at the seams in our current location. We are a physical therapy and wellness center. And so we straddle a lot of different market positions. We're not a traditional physical therapy center because we, first of all, we're out of network. And second of all, we feed right in and integrate directly with multiple wellness services. Our goal is to meet people where they are and take them where they want to go in terms of staying as independent and as healthy as possible. So sometimes that means that we're meeting them when they need a lot of dependent care. They need a lot of the therapeutic physical therapy care, but a lot of times it means they need to come in there, and we need to push them along a continuum into more wellness activities, but so that they still have access to our expertise. So we have a staff of 10 physical therapists, 9 physical therapists and growing, Pilates instructors, acupuncture, massage therapy, dietary counseling, personal counseling is the core of our business. And we work very closely with one another to try and determine what people need as they're coming in. Our current space constraints mean that we cannot fully develop 2 additional program areas that we are engaged in, but at a much smaller scale than we would like to be. One is our medical fitness program, which is really designed to be a gym type environment, but for people who really should not be exercising independently. So they may have diabetes, they may have cardiac conditions, they may have special conditions that require more skilled supervision over their exercise programs. And so that's one area of expansion that we would like to see come to fruition in this space. And then the second is that we'd like to expand is what we call our PACE program, which is our speed, power, and agility program for youth athletics. So we work with a lot of teams now. We do it very creatively in limited space, and we use a lot of outside space. But we really would like to move that into a year-round program where we're working on preventing injuries in the young athletes, and that's our perspective, and their perspectives. They want to get better, stronger, and faster in their sports, and so it's a win-win situation there. We also feel like there's a nice simpatico, I guess, with the arts focus of that block in particular, and then clearly we have felt that there's a strong support for arts in Falls Church, and that's our home. I started out in performing arts medicine. I was a dancer. I trained with Washington Ballet, and now we've grown that into a relationship where we direct the health and wellness program for Washington Ballet. So there's a nice synergy there. They always talk about wanting to actually open a suburban satellite facility near us, and so those are kind of neat things to consider down the line. But we work a lot with the Kennedy Center. We work a lot with local dance companies and dance schools. So there's a big arts heart and relationship that we have with many organizations. And we also work with a lot of team athletes. So whether they're in high school or middle school or the local sports clubs, we work with a lot of those different teams. And so we're focused on kids, we're focused on arts, we're focused on trying to manage and prevent chronic disease. And this space allows us to realize that vision in a more complete way. One of the things that we're currently located on 2 different floors, and so one of the things that's important to us is to try and get onto the same floor so that we can really visualize the continuum of care that we believe that we offer, so that we start with a quieter zone and we move into a moderate zone and then we move into a highly active zone. All of that space, all of the window fronts will be open. Any of the quieter, sort of one-on-one care will be tucked into the back. What will be at the front will be all of the group kind classes and the group activities. And the area on the far end, the far right, which is where most of the windows are, that's where the speed and agility training will be. So you see a lot of power activity going on in there. We do currently have a tradition and culture of hospitality within our business. So we already offer food and drink before and after. It's sort of there all the time. And so to transition that into more of a retail setting and opening that up to the surrounding environment for people who are not necessarily clients but just want to come in and grab a healthy convenience food option, that makes really good sense to us. So I think that's probably a good summary of where we are and what we'd like to do.
Yes, sir. I think as you can probably tell, this is a kind of use that's going to be a destination for a lot of people throughout the region. So it's going to draw in a lot of people from Fairfax County and Arlington County because the services offered here aren't offered at many other places. So it's going to end up being a destination for a lot of different people. So we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great. Thank you very much. Planning Commissioner?
What are your hours of operations?
We operate 6 days a week.
Okay.
We start typically at 5:45 in the morning. Excuse me.
Bright and early, right?
Yep, we start bright and early. We're 5:45 in the morning, and we typically stop at 9 p.m.
Okay.
On Saturdays, we stop a little earlier, and we try not to open on Sundays.
And you're projecting 150 customers a day or clients a day?
Yep.
And what is the parking like? The parking like in the building? Will it be sufficient? And I guess I'm addressing this to the gentleman from representing the building. I mean, how's the parking? How will the 150 clients will be able to be accommodated?
Yeah, there's some structured parking there, and there's also street parking available. So it's anticipated there'll be plenty of parking, and we're not asking for modification from the parking requirements.
I wouldn't say there's a lot of street parking available in that neighborhood, at least from what I can see.
From my recollection, there is street parking available. I don't know how busy it gets at certain hours, but we're anticipating there'll be plenty of parking available.
I think part of that question too is the flow of clients. So when there are group classes, more clients are coming in at once, but then we stagger individual appointments, so they're always staggering over one another. So there's sort of a constant flow in and out, and that I'm sure will help with any parking situation. We have significantly more parking available here than we do in our current location. So.
Well, I live in that sort of general vicinity and go by there quite often, so I've been looking at vacant spaces for a number of years. So to see a state-of-the-art facility like this that's tied into the dance community is, to me, it's very exciting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
John?
And actually, I had a parking question too, but it's more for Gary, whether, this would, because you had the change and the parking arrangement was set up for the previous arrangement, whether this would be a problem, because it's great having 150 people showing up, but I mean, is that potentially a problem?
Well, I mean, the project was approved on a retail parking requirement basis, and there was some shared parking that was built into that. There also is a shared arrangement with the office building next door to use those facilities. Particularly availability would be high at night, for any kind of assembly kinds of things that might happen here. So I mean, the parking numbers, I'll put those in the next staff report. so everybody has at least that number, but, you know, it was pre-approved for this mixed-use project based on a retail basis, so, you know, the space has been vacant. And those spaces are located right adjacent in the back of that space.
Okay.
And then the only other question I had was about the, I think the idea of giving you, you know, a 20-year lease is a great idea. My only question is, in here, you open it up to 20 years, but then there's no, well, if, you know, for whatever reason, God forbid, you don't work out, then do we get anything else for 20 years as well? Because it's been amended here for anybody in the space as opposed to just this use. I mean, I assume before it was 10 years, no more than 10 years for a reason. So I would just say here you're opening it up for you, but then for anybody else in that space. So I would just, you know, basically ask you if that's what you really want to do.
Yeah, John, let me, I actually, if I can just step in for 1 second. I had a similar question, just reading through the language. The 20-year extension is not, as I read it, it's not limited to just this space. It's actually, it would also affect where Unit 122 is, if I'm reading it correctly.
114? Yeah.
I'm sorry, 112.
112 is occupied by Edward Jones
Right,
now.
but that's on a 10-year right now.
Yeah.
So this would move it to 20.
No, I mean, if the resolution reads that way, that wasn't the intent. The intent was to allow this use and this use only for the 20-year period, and any others would be limited to the 10 years still, except for this additional 2,000 square feet in Unit 114 that I was suggesting we may want to pre-approve, like we'd already had 8,000 square feet.
Okay. We can have Mr. Foster look at that and
so-
make sure that's the intent. But I think
Okay.
John's second point on that is that the application isn't limited to 20 years for this particular use. It would be, you know, if for some reason this goes forward and they don't succeed or end up moving to a different space, the 20 years would still remain.
Yeah,
in
it
the
didn't seem
language.
limited to a space or a tenant.
Okay.
And I'm just asking, was that meant? Because on line 159, it says, all retail services and/or business uses shall be limited to lease terms of no more than 20 years. All retail service and/or business.
Okay.
So I'm just asking if that is the intention, because it doesn't seem like it was.
But it sounds like that wasn't the intention, so we just need to update that language a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's just fixing.
I would
Okay.
agree. I agree.
Okay.
Question, Gary, are you saying that you're recommending that Unit 114 also get an extension to 20 years?
It, pre-approval for non-retail, and whether it be 10 years or 20 years, I didn't even specify that
Okay,
on that.
because I mean,
so
to me,
that
it
could be
makes
part of
sense
it.
for 20 years because the building owner's going to put in $1 million or $1.5 million, and that's the reason
Yeah,
for the 20
I
years,
understand
but I
that.
don't see
I was
why
thinking to
that
leave
space-
10 on that, but just pre-approve it for
Yeah.
non-retail.
It-
And I
it's
could
an
be more
exceptional-
specific with that as well.
Right. You're giving an extension because of an exceptional circumstance. They're putting in a lot of money, so.
Right,
Okay.
yeah, no, that deserves 20.
So the
Yeah.
space next to Creative Cauldron, the 114 would be
10.
actually, well, it says Unit 114 on here, so that would be for,
I know
oh,
what
yeah.
you said.
So it would be for 10, and we would just go ahead and pre-approve that for non-retail, well, for expanded.
10 years of non-retail, yes.
Yeah, non-retail, okay.
Mhm. That was my intent.
So I have spoken a lot about this topic because I feel strongly that our city code gets too wrapped up in these uses, and I think I would almost use this as a poster child for the difficulty of defining what a retail use and whether something's appropriate or inappropriate. I would think if I owned a shopping center, this is a good retail use. And it almost feels like a kind of a how many angels can dance on the head of a pin argument as to whether this is or is not a retail use. We have defined it as a service use, so now we have to go in and redefine it as a potential retail use when I think it was a retail use in the first place. And I'm not sure this isn't sort of the highest and best use of the space anyway. And what's interesting to me is that we're sort of overlaying on our code, which it seems to me is flawed in the first place, whether or not we like these uses, when we should say, hey, does this kind of quack like a duck and walk like a duck? And it seems like a duck to me. So I don't, I could keep going in the interest of time. You get the gist of it.
Wendy, did you want to?
Other questions?
No, not really. I heard the first presentation at the EDO, and I found it very, very interesting, and can see it working out within that space very well. And I think that the foot traffic would be excellent. And I also like the idea of future reaching out to, I know you mentioned that you even do some training for the CAPS and stuff like that, right?
Well, not the CAPS.
No, not the CAPS, somebody else.
We do work with
Okay, individual ones,
players.
okay,
But,
okay.
yeah, no, we work for Washington Ballet. We
Right,
work with-
and in town,
Yes.
visitors
Yes.
from other productions.
Yes.
But I just think the whole thing sounds very exciting, and like it'd be a good fit and get that place filled.
Yeah.
Others on the planning commission? All right, why don't we go to council? Council questions? Jen?
Russ, I actually didn't understand what you said. Rob, sorry, Rob. I didn't understand what you said. That's Russ, that's Rob.
If you and I owned a shopping center, why wouldn't we want this as a tenant? What about them would we say, no, this isn't a retail tenant, this isn't good for a shopping center? What aspect of this is not appropriate for a retail shopping center? I think that would be, to distill it down, that's sort of where I would feel. Now, our code goes off with retail uses, and this, one of the ones that everybody gets hot about is banks or some of these other things, that it is or is not a retail use. But this is a case where, you know, maybe we've defined this as a service use, but I'm not sure that it is. I mean, I'm not sure that it is. And so that's the substance of what I'm saying.
For a regular shopping center, this use would be allowed in the commercial space. In some of the mixed-use projects we approved in the last 5 years, we were specific and narrow in the definition of the first floor space as retail only. So we were expecting retail, the market changed, and so now, we find some of these projects are struggling with vacant space still, and so we're having to undo some of that narrowing of the retail definition.
Understood, okay. Other council members? Ira?
Thank you. I agree, this makes a lot of sense and deserves the support. We can discuss a little bit later this particular issue, because I like the idea of having some say, and I'm certainly willing to spend the time, if it has to come back for a use change, to devote a little energy to it. Not worried about that. But this clearly is a good fit. And the issue, I think, that was raised by John and others about the 20 years, if that's what's required. I mean, I don't know, and you don't have to go into it, but the need for 20 years may be involved not just investment, I imagine financing and tax issues, et cetera, that go into that, which is okay. But after year 10, which would be the normal, what if you decided, I mean, how is the lease going to be written if you decide to sell it, or, sell a firm, or something happens and it doesn't go forward, or somewhere in the next 10 years, what recourse the city have is to go to another purpose? Would we then come back because of a change in the purpose? And what, it's not you, it's what happens in the next 10 years that may be out of your control. Maybe how can a lease be drafted that it stays within similar activity or the retail?
Clause in the lease.
So what we're saying here is, we would just limit it to this use and this use only. And then, if it were to change, let's say 10 years, they decided to do something else and the space became available, then they would have to come back and, in the same kind of amendment process as this.
Yeah.
Potentially. I mean, that's the way the intent was.
I'm going to jump out of order again. Just on that point, that touches upon a question that I had is, we're talking as though a use has been defined. I'm not seeing it in the language other than the class being expanded. So we're talking about a particular applicant, but the language doesn't, say body dynamics anywhere in there. So while I hope it works out, I don't think you all have a lease yet put together. Certainly not one that's in the packet. So something could happen. We approve this, something goes wrong with the lease, and now we've just granted. To your point, Rob, I mean, this could be a situation where it could be another use that fits within the definition that we're not comfortable with for whatever reason, given our code such as it is and how it provides usages. It could all turn out to be, I think even with this language, could be office if I'm not mistaken. So I think it's something that we need to think through. If I can just say my 2 cents and then I'll open it back up. I'm supportive of this particular use. I think it does make sense to Rob's point. One of the questions that I had provided before is sort of what is the difference as far as economic return to the city through our fiscal model, and this I think came out actually better than what would have been the traditional retail. It doesn't account for spin-off, which is I think the hope when council passed it, approved this years ago. So from a fiscal model, it does make sense. So I think that gets to the point that we were making before. So this particular use makes sense, but that's not defined. So I think if we can tighten that up, I think that would be helpful. And then I think a point that was raised before is sort of this notion of a clawback provision that if for some reason something happens where this body dynamics doesn't work out or they end up moving or something happens within whatever lease they negotiate, that it would come back before council if that particular use is no longer there. I think I heard that in 2 comments, one from Ira and one from John. So I'm going to open it up, and then I may have other questions. Ron?
Well, I'm going to take it. I mean, this line of questioning is a good example why governments generally don't do a good job running private enterprises like this. The idea that you can dictate what the markets are going to do. There are reasons why you have broad brush considerations in urban planning. There's reasons why you don't want a bank on every corner, because frankly the market was strong for banks, and banks are not very vibrant when it comes to street scenes, and they operate in limited hours. But beyond that, there's a broad range of retail uses, as Rob said, and this fits right in with it, where it meets every criteria of what we're trying to establish. And if they don't do that, you're still going to have a heck of a build out here with something that somebody's going to come in and take advantage of. For us to sit here and say, well, we don't like this or we don't like that. One of the reasons I don't live in a community with a homeowners association anymore is because I didn't want somebody telling me what color I can paint my door down to how tall my letters were at 2 inches versus 3 inches. And I hate to see the council going down the path of thinking we can dictate to the market about those kinds of uses. So I'm perfectly comfortable with this or with any other business like this that comes in if this one doesn't work out. And I want to make sure we don't foreclose too many possibilities when we negotiate this.
Ira?
I'm sorry, I don't understand some of the tone of the comments here. Everybody's supportive.
Yeah.
So who is it that we're stopping? I mean, what is the straw man here?
I'm hearing very specific comments. I keep hearing we want to control this. We're concerned about future control. We need to put restrictions in the lease. And so we need to be careful with how far we go down that path, or we're going to end up with a whole lot more vacant space than we have now. That's the point. From a philosophical point of view, which is the level at which we should be dealing with
As long
this.
as they're the intent, there's no changes, there's no dictation to them.
But
This
see-
is your
but see,
project,
that-
you do what you want, and we're prepared to go down. I
I-
don't
I-
understand in year 12 or 13.
Let's take one at a time. So let's give other council members an opportunity.
Okay.
Others? And I think the issue is we've got a code such as it is with definitions, and I think part of it is that the SE was granted on certain provisions, and I think that's sort of the tension that we're trying to work out.
Well,
So
that's part of the issue. I mean, I wasn't here when we came up with this 10-year rule, but it's a pretty wacky rule to put into a commercial lease when you have just the idea that we say we're going to limit something for 10 years. Well, either it's a good use or it's not a good use, but saying 10 years, that's not even the same as, sometimes it's possible to say 1 year, let's have a transient use, but 10 years is, anything beyond 2 or 3 years is longer term in the commercial leasing business. So it's an arbitrary number somebody stuck in there because they felt they wanted to have some control over something. And we're basing our whole discussion as if it's all being based off 10 years lease restriction being the norm when it's not the norm. I guess that's the point.
Others?
I don't know if we can assume what the motivation was for the 10 years. I don't know. I don't know if any of us was around when that was put in the code. And I think the conversation here was just trying to make sure it was just matched up with the use. And it seems the 20 years for, you know, $1 million, $1.5 million investment makes sense. So I think everybody's kind of on the same page, but just like Mayor Baruch said, you know, we do have to just make sure that you know, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and things match up. That's all. And I think it is a good question to ask. Well, we all don't want to see it happen, but what would happen after the 10 years if it didn't work out? And so I think that's just being prudent.
Others? Dave?
As much as I'd love to weigh into this discussion, my wife is the editor of the Journal of Orthopedic and Sports Physical Therapy, or rather the publisher, and until John Foster clears me, I can't really engage in the debate. I will say that this firm is highly, highly respected in the field, and I won't say anything else other than that. Thank you.
Other council members? All right. Gary, does this give you enough?
Yeah, I'm gonna, from what I've heard and confirmed, is I'm gonna modify the resolution to, all the provisions will be limited to this use under all the terms that we'd already had in there. And my only question then is, on this additional unit, do you want me to have that extra 2,000 space in there, or is the consensus is go ahead and leave it as is?
I would just leave it as is.
Leave it as is. So I'll pull that out when I'm making this specific to this user.
And I did have one other question. This is sort of like the first time where I've seen an SE actually where the use, the particular use or the particular business that's going in be there as part of the application process. Am I right on that? That's something we haven't seen before. Normally the applicant, meaning the building owner, generally wants greater use, but they don't know who the tenant is going to be. Is that?
That's correct. In the past, it's been the owners of the space that have been in representing it, having discussions with a possible tenant. In those cases, they define some banks and so forth, and we process those, and those actually didn't happen. So,
yeah. And I will say, part of my interest in this is because of the type of use it actually is. So, you know, and I'll say more about it. And what I mean by that is the spin-off that can be generated and how the use is going to actually interact with the area. So, you know, and what I will say philosophically is that this was part of an SE. I wasn't here when this was voted on, but there was some, you get X in exchange for Y. So it's not just about trying to control the situation, but there was, you know, if you will, decisions made on that. But again, some of us weren't here for that, including myself. But I think this use does make sense. Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, planning commissioners.
It's my newest pen. I know.
It's a little bit less. And also, it struck me. What's yours?
Hello.
Oh, no, that's.
All right. Oh, okay, all right. So,
Good evening.
This organization goes fast.
All right, why don't we come back together? We are going to be taking up the stormwater working plan and schedule. So, Wyatt?
Just a brief introduction. Bill Hicks, our Director of Public Works, and Brenda Creel, our Director of Utilities, will be providing the staff report tonight. After our town hall meeting on the flooding issues that we experienced citywide on September 8th, we sat down as staff and reviewed what we heard at that town hall meeting, and then tried to identify those things that we thought could be addressed. And then we started to build a work plan off of those items. A lot of this work is well underway, or has been underway for years, to try to address these issues, and we'll speak to those. But there are some new policy directions that come out of what happened with that flooding event for our consideration, and out of that town hall meeting that we want to lay out here tonight, get council feedback on, continue that discussion, and then go forth and finalize a plan and implement it. Our order of presentation tonight is Bill Hicks first, and you have a memo in your packet from him dealing with stormwater issues. Brenda Creel has a memo also on the issues related to backflows in our sanitary sewer collection system. And so we'll take those both as sort of two distinct aspects of the problem with their own definition of the problem. We'll start with Bill Hicks first.
Thank you, Wyatt. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I appreciate this opportunity to kind of brief you on our stormwater program in 8 broad strokes, as is laid out in the memorandum in your packet. And I'm just going to go through and kind of highlight some key items in there and move through as quickly as I can. The first item is our maintenance activities. These are the things that we do day in and day out to keep our 140,000 linear feet of stormwater infrastructure moving. We've got 1,400 manholes and catch basins and appurtenances in our system, and all of that requires a keen eye from our operations staff. This year, in order to facilitate that work, engineering developed a new map book. And this map book has each of our stormwater reaches in the city, and we have those in the trucks for the guys who are out in the field. The engineers have them in the office. It facilitates communication, and we're going to expand on this as time goes on, but I think it's a great tool to help us move in that direction. Another item that's in our maintenance activities is we have purchased a new piece of equipment. It's a flusher vacuum. It's trailer mounted, not truck mounted. And it's to replace our old truck-mounted piece of equipment. We cobbled together funding through last year that included the sale of our old refuse trucks, cobbled enough together to make that purchase. That will be delivered. We expect that to be delivered in mid-December. It takes a while for them to build the thing. They build them to order. Once that's in place, I think we'll see this truck out in the field doing service, where our last truck was being serviced much of the time. So we're glad to see that coming about. The second item on here is an effort to do a storm sewer evaluation study. And what that does is it builds on this map book. A number of years ago, we hired a firm, Apex, to go out and remove debris from all of our storm reaches in the city. And at the same time, they filmed those storm reaches as they were coming out. So they have pictures of what was inside each of those storm reaches. All of that video is digital, but it's in a big box right now. And so what we're doing is we're having GKY and Associates, one of our on-call stormwater consulting firms, take all of that information, truth test this with the information that was collected in the field, and then convert that to our GIS layer, which allows us an excellent tool to make sure that our day-to-day operations are working most efficiently, as well as our capital planning. Where is that corrugated metal pipe that's failing? Where do we need to focus our efforts, and how do we plan for that expenditure in the future? The next item is our watershed management plan. This is an earlier draft that staff reviewed, provided comments to our consultants. Mayor Baruch is on our Watershed Advisory Committee. We've been working for many months to try and see the completion of this document. We will have a final draft ready for the Watershed Advisory Committee delivered to them on the 28th of November, so next week. They will have this in their hands for a couple weeks before we hold a December 13th meeting to get all of their comments, solidify this, and then move it before you guys for adoption. In this document, it talks about what our stormwater program should look like in the coming years. It talks about policies and ordinance changes, but one of the key things that's in here is a list of 21 capital projects that help us guide where we're going to spend capital monies and where we're going to put our efforts in the coming years. And I'll just call out the one that was, these were worked through with our consulting firm, AMEC. They worked through some objective criteria, some planning level expenditures, what could be expected in terms of flooding mitigation versus water quality improvements, public safety. And we came up with 21 projects. The first project of which is, after the objective work was done, then it was vetted through the Watershed Advisory Committee to make sure that what we have is in the right order. And that group rearranged some of these, and the project that's risen to the top is work that's in the City Hall and Great Falls area. And it's to, one, improve water quality that comes off of the city property here, as well as hold water back, and to improve the conveyance of the water that goes down through Great Falls Street and onto Little Falls to try and mitigate flooding that happens in that area. So it's a combination of water quality, best management improvements, as well as upsizing pipes to minimize flooding. So the next item on your agenda is directly from what came out of the September 7th Town Hall meeting. And we were there, we were very excited to have a number of our residents very outspoken, and we had a great dialogue that night. And as Wyatt mentioned, we came back and discussed what we should do next, how that event should change what we're doing going forward. And we said, let's capitalize on this stakeholder involvement. Let's send out a survey. And we vetted that survey through Public Utilities, through the city manager's office, and that survey was put in the post office today and should be delivered to our residents in the next day or so. It's got 22 questions that are all about flooding on private property, in the yards. It's delivered to all of our single-family homes, so that should be out and available this week for their completion. We would like their responses in early December, where we'll compile all of the results and try and have that turned back around in January. The next item on the agenda is, or on my list, is floodplain management. As you know, we work with FEMA to manage our local floodplain ordinance and floodplain requirements, as well as manage our community rating system, which is where we garner points in a program that in turn, for a certain number of points, we get rated on a scale of 1 to 10. And for every point lower on the scale, we're in 8, you get a 5% discount on flood insurance premiums for our residents. So we are currently in 8, which affords a 10% reduction in flood insurance premiums. And just by coincidence, I got a letter today. It's preliminary, but we expect to be rated a 7, as this draft letter says, so we will be getting a 15% discount for our residents on our flood insurance premiums. So I appreciate all of our staff's efforts. Jason Woodstrom has been instrumental, as well as Allison Lorenz and Davida Goddard-Eason, who's now with the school system. We're also working through an effort to try and bring our somewhat antiquated floodplain ordinance up to snuff, and you'll see that in the coming months. We've been working with AMEC to try and tighten that to mirror the model ordinance at the state. Stormwater regulations, this is probably the least sexiest item in this list. Nonetheless, it is a big driver. This is all about the TMDLs and the Chesapeake Bay and the state stormwater obligations. We don't know for sure what this is going to cost, but as the regulations have been getting refined over the last few months, we have made our best estimate to be about $24–25 million over the next 15 years. This is significantly about water quality. So $25 million about water quality in the next 15 years. That's a lot of money. This stormwater program that we've laid out in our watershed management plan tries to take those requirements as well as the needs that we see here in our community, the things like flooding on Great Falls and Little Falls Street and flooding on Columbia Street. So it tries to tie those regulations to local need as well. So it's coming. We'll see how it works out. Which brings us into a nice segue to talk about stormwater budgeting, which is next on your list. The last chapter in the watershed management plan is about funding, how we are going to fund this $25 million. And there's several different ways. The way we fund our stormwater programs now is through the general fund with our capital improvement program as well as our operational monies. Other ways to do this are through stormwater service districts, where you use an ad valorem tax just like you have today. It's not based on impervious cover, but you dedicate that particular money to stormwater. So it's no longer tied to the general fund, but it's specific. Or there's another way, which is a user fee or a stormwater utility, which uses impervious cover or another surrogate to say this is what your cost for stormwater is, and you pay that. All of those are options. What we're saying is that at some point we have to pay for this program, and we're going to work with the city manager's office over the coming months to prepare proposals that you guys can consider as we move this program forward. The last item on our list are capital projects, and I'll mention two that are underway right now. The first is a three-part project that's funded in part with a DCR grant, a Department of Conservation and Recreation's grant. It's about $115,000 in total. $50,000 of that comes from the state. Most of the rest of the money is actual staff time, which we get credit for. And we're working in three parks, Lincoln Park, Berman Park, and Crossman Park. And we are both improving water quality coming out of those, but we're also mitigating flooding. I don't know if anybody has seen Lincoln Park the day after it rains, but there's a whole lot of water in that park. And our efforts are to try and both improve the water that's coming off of that park, but also mitigate the flooding so that park is much more usable during the course of the year. Similarly, we have a much larger capital project that's funded significantly through a state and tribal assistance grant. It's about a $1.7 million project. Over half of that is funded with federal monies. And it will target two separate projects. One is on Pearson Branch near the Scout Hut between the Scout House between Irving Street and Spring Street to improve the stream bank and beds there. It's eroding away, and we need to stabilize that. We're losing both the pedestrian trail and trees there, so we want to do some stream bank stabilization there, as well as in Howard E. Herman Stream Valley Park, there's Co-Branch. Co-Branch was targeted in an earlier Dewberry study for daylighting. It's also a park that has a lot of flooding when it rains. And this project will, one, daylight the lower portion of Co-Branch, but it will also mitigate that flooding, try and control it so that that park is useful when it does rain. Those are two big areas that we're working currently. The capital budget, the capital improvement program budget that's been approved for FY12 has monies in the out years from FY13, $1.2 million on out till the completion of that 5-year program, and that totals $7.5 million. That money was envisioned to get this program started. So that's coming up in FY13.
We'll have opportunities for questions for Bill, but I thought it would be most useful to go straight into the discussion about sanitary sewer. We got a lot of comments at the town hall meeting about that closed. And so, you know, we need to define the problem, talk about what we've been doing over the years to address it, but then consider some of our options moving forward. Brenda.
Thank you. With me this evening is Rodney Collins, our chief engineer. He manages our sanitary sewer rehabilitation program, and Robert Goff, superintendent of public utilities, and he manages our maintenance program. The staff report I provided this evening outlines the work that we've done to date, including the comprehensive sanitary sewer rehab program that we began in 2004. That program was based on and informed by a consulting report in 2002 that provided hydraulic modeling, and advised on a flow monitoring and data analysis associated with that, and recommended system improvements. We've been pursuing that program since 2004. It includes smoke testing, which will identify infiltration and inflow into our system, manhole inspections, and closed-circuit TV inspections of our pipes. To date, 40% of our system has been evaluated, and 25% of that total has been rehabilitated, and that includes lining of our pipes. We use a trenchless technology. It lines the pipe with a cured-in-place process, and that program has worked very, very well. We are in the second phase of the evaluation. We're currently evaluating another 40% of the system. We'll have those results, the final report, in February, March. We've asked for an expedited information on the smoke testing component of that evaluation. We expect that in the next month to 4 to 6 weeks. The remaining 20% of the evaluation will take place by the end of 2012. And at that point, we would develop, as we have in the past, a program of prioritized rehabilitation. We currently fund this program at $400,000 annually through the Sewer Fund CIP. And in addition to that program, we have an ongoing maintenance program. Our crews are daily flushing and inspecting our system. We have found the rehabilitation program to be successful in reducing the number of calls that we've received from homeowners regarding sanitary backups. In view of the recent rain event and the town hall meeting, we did get new information that suggested that there may be some additional problems in the system, and we're in the process of evaluating those. To date, we've received calls from 16 homeowners in response to that, to the last rain event, and we're working through that list to determine how many of those were in fact sanitary sewer backups. It will be important for us as we go forward to define the extent of the problem. We're hoping that the survey that Mr. Hicks outlined will help get us some additional information on the number of homeowners who experienced sanitary sewer backups. That will help us as we go forward to identify the policies and programs that we need to address this and to size the solution correctly. And your materials include a number of options that we can evaluate and pursue going forward. Our work in terms of repairing and rehabilitating our the public system will continue. In addition, we'll be looking at modifications to our manholes. There may be some additional measures that we can take in that regard. Private lateral defects are being identified through the smoke testing program that I described, and we will be notifying homeowners of the results of the smoke testing and requesting that they repair their private laterals. There are some protective measures that we can consider: the installation of check valves. Homeowners can do that now at their own expense. We may want to consider looking at that as funded through the sewer fund. Preventative measures, some localities require at point of sale or at other, along other timelines that homeowners be required to test their sewer laterals and confirm that they are sound, and if not, to replace those and make repairs. There are sources of I&I from private drain connections and some pump connections to our sewer laterals, and that's a more complicated and potentially expensive issue to address. We've done some preliminary research with regard to policies that can be pursued for both voluntary and mandatory disconnections from the system. We'll look to council for guidance on whether that's something that you want us to consider. Public education campaign is appropriate regarding preventing private property I&I and measures that can be taken. And as I mentioned before, our CIP includes currently a $400,000 annual expenditure, and that is currently what is sustainable given our current rates, but again, that can be reevaluated going forward. So those are some of the options that we've identified to date, and we're looking for feedback from council as to how we might proceed.
Thanks, Brenda. Why don't we start off with questions, and then we can try to drill down into the going forward items where I think staff is requesting some feedback. Johanna?
Yeah, Brenda, this is excellent work, and I appreciate all the diligence that you and staff have done to get to the bottom of some of these issues. I'm wondering if the $400,000 that we have annually for attending to these issues needs to be accelerated. Not that I'm going to get everybody to agree to this, but in light of recent events. I guess because I'm wondering, in all of the unusual events that occurred on September 8th, 9th, was there significant, in your view, health risk exposure to residents as a result of what had happened and during the flooding? And are we liable or exposed by any federal or regional health standards with regards to, as I said, the experience that 16 households had? So does this go beyond simply inconvenience, and as a city, should we be attentive to possible health risks either now or in the future?
For those homeowners who contact us when they have a sanitary backup, we advise them to contract with a professional firm that would clean up in the aftermath of a sanitary backup. And certainly our goal as a system is to minimize this homeowner citizen exposure to a sanitary system backup. I think we need to, as I mentioned earlier, have a better data regarding the extent of the problem so that we can identify an appropriate solution. We don't want that to that work to continue endlessly, but we had heretofore, prior to this storm, felt that we had made significant progress in terms of the sanitary sewer backups. We had an occasional backup that would be caused by a temporary blockage in our system, but this event was extraordinary, and I think it would be appropriate for us to get the results of the system evaluation and some more information on the extent of the problem so that we can solve it appropriately. Any addition to that? In terms of
Other council members? I had a couple questions. I'll start out with the stormwater management, and I feel comfortable with the way that this has been laid out. I'm really glad to hear about the surveys that are being done, because I think that will give us a lot of data. The one question that I had about that, I know that at the town hall we had at least one business owner that had some issues that appeared to have been ongoing, but the survey, at least from the summary, doesn't seem to cover any commercial properties, and I'm just wondering if there's a reason for that. So just wanted to explore that a bit, because I think at least one business did come forward at the town hall.
Our survey is directed to the single-family homes in the city, no question about it. It's not directed to commercial properties. I think we all left when we debriefed and discussed what our next moves were. We felt like single-family homes, that was a place where we were seeking a voice that we had not yet heard from. We have not approached the commercial folks in this way. We would hope that they would come forward. When they come to us, we certainly respond appropriately, I think.
And I would add, I think we have a pretty good sense of, because where the businesses are affected, we know where it's coming from, and it's a public right-of-way issue, and their businesses are right on the public right-of-way. And in the neighborhoods is where we think we have the data gap, and that was the reason for the target.
And I would take it that the chamber would let you know as well through that outlet as well. So I would just encourage staff to just make sure that conversation with the chamber is happening. So there may not be a gap, but just to make sure that that's being addressed. And then as far as how we're defining single-family homes, does that take into account? I'd heard that there had been some flooding for underground garages, for example. Have we been in touch with any of our mixed-use projects?
We have not approached, we treat our mixed-use projects just like a commercial project, and so the survey is really silent on that side.
And then how about on townhome communities?
We have decided not to expand they were not included in this first phase, and the reason for that is that we felt like single-family homes would know the most about their situation. We thought the issue was mostly about single-family home concerns. If we feel like there needs to be another phase, it's very easy for us to send this out. But typically, townhome folks are tied in. It's treated as a commercial site when we go through a site plan process, and much of the infrastructure that's associated with that is often unknown to the townhome owner. And so we simply have excluded them here. Most of the complaints that were voiced at that town hall meeting were from single-family homes. It's easy enough for us to reach out to those additional 700 homes, but we have not done that in this first phase.
As a townhome owner, it's something you may, and I haven't heard any in the community, and you may want to reach out to some of the associations and see if they can provide any data that may be helpful. So I would just hate to have gaps while we're trying to seek this, but there may be efficient ways of doing that.
Fair enough.
700 is fairly large.
Right.
There may be a way of just tapping in and getting some initial, and then making your calls. But I leave that all into your judgment. But
thank you.
I just don't want to see that there's gaps in these various pieces. And then I'm going to open it up again. I had a couple questions on the sanitary side. Others? Ira?
Just a point. If I remember, we had an issue. I contacted you regarding some overflow. Had nothing to do with the rain. For those homeowners, I mean, if I recall, it's any repairs that have to do on the property and so forth, or the responsibility of the HOA. And so this is something that's going to add to the HOA costs. Make no mistake, and it is what it is in terms of that. If I was correct in my understanding.
That is correct. The improvements on private property, and a townhome community has a lot of private property that feels very public because it's a communal effort, but all of that remains private property, and the responsibility is borne on the owner, not the city.
Bill, just as far as the the good work that's being done with the monies that we got for the park water quality issues. How were those identified?
Those projects, we worked with our Parks and Rec folks. We found projects that were suggested in the overall, well, we started with a big list that we had kept for the watershed management plan. There were some 40 or 50 projects. These were in that list. When you go to apply for a grant, you have to have ownership of the property, the complications for the need to spend this within 2 years or 18 months is very tight. So we looked for projects that were easily manageable within that bigger list. And so that's how we got to where they are. It doesn't, it's not the top list, and it's also not a huge amount of money.
Right, and that's what I was trying to get at. I mean, we're going to be asked about this. Is it fair to say that the money was matched with what's doable within that money to get the project done?
Without question.
And the timing. So
yes.
One could be a higher priority, but it may cost $300,000 and you just don't have the funding to do that. So you went to a lower priority because it can be done within this amount.
Right. When we're spending somebody else's money, you kind of do it opportunistically. And that's the very best way we could do it. We have vetted those projects with the Tree Commission, the Environmental Services Council, and the Parks and Rec Commission. And we had conceptual designs to show them, and they were all very pleased with those projects. That was done, I think, in September.
All right. Other questions? Okay. I had a couple questions regarding the sanitary sewer. And Brenda, I think sort of answered, as I was looking at some of the questions where you would all like guidance. One of the things that I'm still grappling with is identifying the extent of the problem that's, I'll put it all under the rubric of stormwater management. And part of that is certainly sewer management, but I'm not sure, for example, how much of the problems are contributed by the I&I with, issues with laterals, with issues of hookups where they shouldn't be from stormwater into the sanitary sewer, things of that nature. So, once we get into providing you all with some comments, there's just some data that's missing, and I know that you all are working on getting that data, but some of the items that are on it are going to be extremely expensive towards the homeowners. So I'm trying to gauge before we even go down that road if it's a marginal improvement to the overall system. Does it make sense to, do and utilize some of these tools, which are going to be very expensive, whether it's for the city or whether they're for private homeowners. So knowing the amount of benefit with the cost, I think would help. And but I'll leave it at that and get other council members' feedback. So just turning it back to staff, should we concentrate perhaps on the going forward items so we can provide some direction to staff? Would that be useful?
Yes.
Okay. Council, thoughts on the going forward? So we're on the November 16th memo from Ms. Creel to Wyatt and to us. Johanna?
Yeah, I don't know if I made my point as clear as it needed to be. One of my concerns is that I want to be assured that in going forward, we are moving at the appropriate pace so as to ensure that we are not in violation of any best practices or health standards. I mean, again, what we experienced in September was, flood of the century, unbelievable, external forces. But just to make certain that the city is in no way exposed, and that this is that this guides our priorities, that we are absolutely in line with national, federal mandates in this regard. That's all I was interested in.
Understood.
Others? Why?
I was just going to provide a little bit more of a response also. The, to Councilmember Berry's question. We need to assess it a little bit more, but here's what I think our instincts are on it. That we do a good job on the public aspect of the problem. The sewer mains that are in the street, we have a good program to get those lines and to solve those problems. The problem is on the private side, which we're not allowed under current law to spend money to fix that. We can't spend public money on private property to fix those. So that's going to be more in the nature of either a voluntary system that is really more public relations oriented to alert people to the problem, get people to buy into the idea that this is something that everyone ought to team up on and fix over time, or whether it would be more robust in the form of regulatory mandates. Where it comes from people's basement drains. Those are going to be really difficult to disconnect. It comes from sump pumps. Those are hard to find, but probably not so difficult to disconnect. It comes from some roof gutters. Those are probably pretty rare, but those are easy to disconnect. And so amongst those three options, and then cracked laterals, and those are expensive to repair. But there could be some things that when a property changes hands, that there's a process that has to be gone through, kind of like with lead paint testing, you would have a lateral test. That would be a potential policy option. Be pretty heavy expense for the new purchaser or the seller, however that shakes out. So those types of things are what we can contemplate doing that would, I think, accelerate some solutions, but they're going to require a lot of public input, and they're very impactful for the homeowners. So that's why we haven't done it before, and that's what we will confront if we take that on.
In terms of the last thing, isn't when you sell a house, don't you have to disclose these types of things?
Well, I don't know the answer to that
I
question.
think if you're aware of it, if someone's aware that their lateral is defective, but
Once you alert them, or when you've done the analysis, then it would become something.
then they would be aware of that. Yes, that's
then
correct.
Since we have people like the market would then determine at the sale of the house when you have to disclose that, how that should be addressed.
Just one other note on it. There have been problem areas in the past where our program has really solved the problem in a measurable way, and I'm thinking of the Dorchester neighborhood as one area where we were getting complaints, and we lined those pipes, and those complaints have pretty much gone away. The Hillwood neighborhood is where we really were surprised with this latest storm. We have not traditionally gotten lots of complaints there, and we got a lot on this storm. So those are the things where we need to understand a little bit more what happened then. Was it water coming in off the streets, or we know from smoke testing there are some private laterals that are not in good shape, but that's the additional data that we need to gather. I think that will help drive this policy discussion.
The reason I mentioned that is because tough regulations have their own issue.
Yeah.
So I was thinking of a way where the point could get across without having the city issue tough, regulations. If it's disclosed, if it's a disclosure issue, then it becomes an issue that the homeowner has to decide how badly they want to fix that in order to sell the house.
Yeah.
Others? All right. Just a couple comments that I have. On the stormwater management side, Bill, one of the things that I hope that the plan will ultimately consider is timing of the projects is going to be important, and what I'm driving at is we're not going to be able to do everything all at one time. So what I hope that the plan considers, and some of it is going to be unavoidable perhaps, but as one project is done, it may lead to consequences for downstream folks, for example, until the next piece gets done, and so on and so forth. So I hope that there is thought given to that. Again, that's going to happen as we try to improve the system overall, but I hope that's something that staff can bring to our attention so we can make the community aware of it as we're going forward and making the improvements in a logical way. and I can say I'm not an engineer. I went to law school because I can't do math well and do engineering well. So I'm going to really be relying on staff for those issues, and I'm sure you're going to be working with consultants on that as well. I want to turn back again to the stormwater, and Ira hit on this a little bit, and that's the regulating aspects. There's 3 items. Those are the 3rd through 5th bullet. The first one being private drain and sump pump connections. Again, I want to provide staff feedback on this, but it's hard to do without knowing what the benefit to the system is going to be and what the costs are to make those types of judgments. So as one council member, I'm going to need a bit more data there. What I will say is you all are thinking through this, I'd also be interested in any incentives that the city can provide. If we, for example, go towards a voluntary model, because there are benefits to water quality in getting the disconnections to happen. So, is there anything that we can do to help, not only help our system, but also help the quality of the water, but take some of the load off homeowners who may wish to do that? And again, that's something I'd want to have thought about some more. The protective measures and the check valves. Again, I've heard from the city manager that there's pluses and minuses of that. Again, it's going to be how much is this going to improve things and how much is it going to cost the sewer system before I'm ready to make a decision on it. It's one that I feel sort of more comfortable with. But again, we would have to figure out how to manage that cost. But before I make a decision on that, I need to know what the benefits overall to the system are going to be. And then I think we've already talked about the notion of the lateral testing and repairing is sold. Again, I think those could be potentially very expensive, and how much is this actually contributing to the problem? And I think hopefully you'll have some data based on what you're seeing from the smoke testing, that will come back. But those are the thoughts that I have. Council, anything else? Any other reactions, Dave?
Yeah, I would really focus on the city's infrastructure and how we ought to expand it if necessary, and what an aggressive, both in terms of timetable and work would be, and cost that out and have that ready for the CIP process next spring. The notion of sending private property owners, in essence, a huge bill on top of what they're already being taxed for, or over and above significant taxes, will, I think, bring a serious negative reaction. So I think we have to be very careful how we proceed there. And if there's a public infrastructure fix to this that we all contribute to, it seems to me that's better than delivering huge bills to a few people.
Yes, certainly our capital program will continue. I think what we're seeing here is the issue of private property I&I and how to manage that piece of it.
Let me proceed here a bit more specifically. Can you measure I&I? In other words,
we can measure flows and we have
by
yes.
house.
By
no. So
by
a bigger issue for runoff may be, or for crowding the system, may be some other part of the city. But because it's an I&I, you're then going to deliver a significant bill to certain homeowners, even though their I&I may contribute very, very little to the problem, or maybe not at all. See, there's an analytical approach here we have to be very, very careful about. You've taken one analytical approach. I&I is terrible, if you have the slightest bit of potential I&I, we're going to hit you with a huge bill. I'm not saying you're saying that, but that's one option. The other approach is to determine what is the actual contribution of I&I to the overall problem, vis-a-vis perhaps other sources. You see where I'm going with this. I don't want to accept necessarily an analytical approach that puts a very high premium on I&I versus other aspects of the issue. And then if it's possible from a public infrastructure, in terms of modernization and expansion to deal with it, that may be a better way, whatever this quantity is. I don't know what this delta or this quantity is.
I mean, I guess the way we approach this is that we can set a meter out on a particular manhole. We can identify the amount of flow that's coming in to that particular area. And then we're also going to be measuring the amount of rain that comes during any particular time. And we'll see a fluctuation between how much flow is in there in a normally time and versus how much flow we have in there during a heavy rain period. And then we can do some analysis and kind of identify in that particular sewer shed, is there a significant amount of I&I and what the contribution to that is.
Right.
So that's kind of the approach that we typically would take on trying to identify, is it an I&I problem or not?
Right. Okay, that strikes me as a better approach. What I was reading here was a different analytical approach. I&I, even any contribution at all, would then bring about the largest penalty in terms of repair. Where the reality is that the overall inability of the system to do what it's supposed to do may come from a larger public source.
As part of as part of the sanitary sewer investigations, that's what we're primarily, one of the objectives is to identify the issues with the public system. And those are what we're, the $400,000 that we'll be using, that's what we're using to address those public-private problems with our lining of the existing sewer lines. We identify which ones are in the worst conditions, where are we having the most problems, where are the potential for disasters, and we're going to address those first and then lay out a prioritized system for the entire system. But then when we're looking at private I&I, when we do smoke testing, we've identified that lateral. There may be some type of quantification that our consultant can provide, how much, based on the amount of smoke that they see, how much flow is potential coming into this particular area, and we can. But if there is any I&I, it's bad I&I. So we're trying to eliminate all of it possible.
Yeah, but I'm not sure how much more time I want to spend tonight, but I want to really question your analysis here, because what is the total contribution of I&I to the overall problem? And if the effect of your analysis is to shift a huge amount of cost to fix the overall problem to those who are contributing I&I, even though I&I may be a very small part of the problem, then it strikes me there's a certain amount of unfairness in your analysis.
I think Dave and I are asking the same question, and that's if we realize that I&I is 5% of the problem, but infrastructure is the other infrastructure on storm water management is not up to capacity, or there's other problems there, and that would cost X million to fix versus trying to have each homeowner do it on the I&I to fix 5% of the problem. It may not make sense at all to do that. So, and I think that's
not
just
what we're
info.
proposing.
No,
Right, and that's not.
Addressed that back in this 2002 report. That's one of the things that they did when they created this hydraulic model. They looked at what should be the sanitary sewer flows based on the housing and the development that we have in the city, and they analyzed each particular line and said, is there sufficient capacity in that already to handle if we would have a very tight system? If we wouldn't have minimal I&I, should our system be able to handle that? And the answer to that question was yes. We have a system right now that if we had a tight system with no I&I, we would be able to handle the potential sewer flows. So what we're seeing is what's causing these backups is from the inflow and infiltration that we're seeing. Where is it coming from? That's what we're trying to gather the data from. Is it private property or is it from public system? That's what we're trying to analyze right this time.
I think I get. So clearly, if the system was working totally perfectly, there shouldn't be any sewer backups.
Yes.
But given that we know that there's some problems with I&I that's causing some problems, but also we know that there's some problems with water that we're supposed to be managing that's also getting in the system right now. You all are trying to figure out how much how much each is contributing. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so our system can handle halftime during the Super Bowl when everybody flushes at the same time. The problem is rain getting into the system. And so then the question is, where's it coming from? And we've been managing the street well for years to keep it from the public right-of-way into the public mains to try to have a tight system. And our concern is that there are other places where it's coming in through private laterals. And that's not, that's our diagnosis, and that's what we need to assess more before we charge off with any kind of regulatory regime. We need to be able to say that very clearly and very definitively. On Hillwood, just in particular, we've lined that pipe, and so we were surprised about the I&I situation on that street. So where's it coming from? And we know from smoke testing some places where it's coming from, and they tend to be on private property. But we need to continue that assessment, and we are very conscious of the fact that putting the burden on the homeowner is a big deal. We've been talking about this and thinking about this for a very long period of time, and we've always known that there's a lot of equity issues and issues associated with that. But when you get down to it, if we're having too much water in the system and it's impacting people downstream, we've got to wrestle with the fact, what are we going to do about that? And we can either do it through good public relations. Well, first we need to really identify the problem and quantify it. But among the spectrum of solutions can be a good publicity campaign to try to get people to buy into being self-starters on this, on their own property, to the range of being having a more regulatory approach. And those will all be things we'll have to flesh out and discuss, I think.
And not lose sight of the other aspect of it, which is Bill's section of the presentation.
Yeah.
Which I think some of the comments, at least that I've made before in years past, and you guys have all gotten sick of me saying it, is we need to keep putting money into the CIP to handle the pure stormwater management issues. So you'll probably keep hearing that from me. So, and some of that we may need to consider working through and continuing to fund. So I think we've done some good work, but more needs to be done there too. Yeah. Anything else before we move on? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
We are on to the bond resolution for school construction, city hall, and refinancing.
You want to introduce me?
Good evening, Council. What you have before you is a resolution to authorize the issuance of general obligation bonds not to exceed $10 million. It's to refund 2 prior bond issues and to fund the city's capital improvement program for FY 2012. We have with us tonight our financial consultant from Davenport, and he is going to make a brief presentation, and then we will answer any questions that you may have. Joe Mason, sorry.
Thank you, Richard. Mr. Mayor, members of council, good to be with you again. As was alluded, The resolution authorizes the issuance and sale of up to $10 million. 4.45 of that, as is shown in the cover memo, is for specific projects related to City Hall, a companion borrowing, if you will, companion to the qualified school construction bonds, which will be issued shortly, to provide the remaining funding for the approximately $6 million schools project, and then a smaller amount for the parks master plan implementation. The balance of the financing is to refund for economic gain, meaning net present value savings, two GO bond issues, one issued in 2006, the other in 2008. Both of those existing bond issues had interest rates in the mid to upper 3% range. It's our considered belief that the market for the interest rate market for such obligations, given the term that they have remaining, is significantly lower than that, and we think we can issue a refunding bond to exchange for the older bonds and provide you with some interest rate savings and interest cost savings. We're estimating roughly at this moment in time $250,000. That's split between the general fund and the water fund. The bulk of the savings go to the water fund. And we're trying to get this transaction done on a bank qualified basis, which you're allowed to issue up to $10 million in any given calendar year. And as long as you remain under that, you can issue the bonds on a bank qualified basis. What is bank qualification? It's simply a tax preference that goes to financial institutions. If they have profits, they can shelter some of their profits by owning these bonds. And it has the net benefit to the city if you sell them on a bank qualified basis of roughly 0.5% in terms of the overall interest rate that you would pay, and that equates to, on $10 million, call it $25,000 a year or thereabouts. So it's well worth pursuing in that fashion. Our plan of finance has been vetted and approved by McGuire Woods, your bond counsel, and we're working diligently to ready the bonds for a competitive sale. Presently, we're thinking along the lines of December 13th, you'd go in the market and close sometime before the end of the calendar year. One of the things that we'll be sending to the credit rating agencies, which, as you are aware, we've had interactions with over the course of the last 12 months or so, they've all affirmed the city's ratings, is not only a public disclosure document called a preliminary official statement. That's the way we tell the market sort of the financial condition of the city and so forth. We're also in the process of preparing a detailed credit presentation on the city to update the rating agencies on all the good things that have been happening here in Falls Church since you sort of recovered, if you will, from the financial difficulties faced during the depths of the recession. So we think we're going to have a very good story to tell to the rating agencies. We're having conference calls with them the week after Thanksgiving, and we'll be asking for ratings middle of the first week in December, with the idea of posting that official statement online, which is how it's done anymore. We don't mail them, and having it out there for about a week or so, and then we'll accept bids here at City Hall via a computer-based bidding platform on December 13th. With that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions? Let me first ask the Budget and Finance Committee, Johanna and Ira, if they have any comments. I think they may have looked at this.
I think, yeah, we did look at it. It makes a lot of sense. It's a good time to take advantage of the Fed's twist, in which the long-term rates have come down. Who knows how long that will take. I forgot to ask one question. Are these are being issued under our own name then, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that's important because that's less expensive. If you go through the state, you have to pay a lot of extra fees. So to the extent that we can continue to issue under our own name, that's a benefit. And that, of course, depends on our standings and how the market view our financial management. So I'm very supportive of this. This makes a lot of sense for the city.
I've got just one question. As I was trying to look at the math, we're going to be, the request is a maximum of 10 million but when I added up the projects, including the ones that are gonna get reissued, it didn't add up to 10. It's like 9.1. Please don't tell me that that's all fees.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No.
So-
No, we just picked a round number. 10 million is the bank qualification limit. There will be items such as accrued interest, a variety of other things, but we're not going to issue anywhere close to 10 million. We'll only issue that which we absolutely need to issue. So,
Great, okay.
and the savings number I gave you before included all of our estimated costs of issuance.
If we can maybe.
And that's why it's up to 10 million, because the cost of issuance is not, it's not a fee certain or that we can tell you right now, but we know what the range is going to be.
If we can maybe include that in the staff report, I just found it, I had a hard time figuring out what was going on, and I jumped to the conclusion that the fees were exorbitant.
So we would put in what probably our best estimate right now as to with fees, what the total bond
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, I'm trying to find my.
And then the other question that I had is, and I agree with Ira that this is a good time to go out to bonding. Specifically on the City Hall and police station expansion, there had been some language that we put into the CIP that identified that the projects would be reviewed by council. There would be a check back. That hasn't happened yet, but I know that there's some amount of money that's needed in order to do the work before it can come back, and the bonds would allow that to happen. How are we borrowing? Are we going to borrow a small chunk and then come back if council feels comfortable, or are we going to borrow the entire project? How's that working out, given that council specifically has asked for a look back?
My recommendation is that council would borrow the whole amount because it's much more cost effective to do a full bond issuance at once. The money is approved in the CIP. It is clearly critical health and safety issues. You wanted to have me come back, and I hope to do it either December 5th or 12th. I was working with Mr. Shields today on that with the more detail. I have the cost estimates in that just came in. Mr. Hicks and I are reviewing them. They are not lower than what I had before you. Everything is going to be needed to do that critical piece. The question will be the prioritization and confirming for you where we'll start and how far we can get. So my recommendation is to issue the full amount, although concurrent with the ordinance, the money won't be expended until you see that plan back. The value of doing this with the bond issuance, besides the 10 million, is that once the resolution's adopted, the city can reimburse itself expenditures now back 60 days. I'm obviously needing to expend for the cost estimating right now, and one of the critical things I want to get done before winter is the correction of our gutters and some of our roof rail snow stuff, so we don't have the ice damming and the damages we had 2 winters ago if we get another heavy snow with having to close down because the entrances were dangerous.
That makes sense. What I would be interested in seeing, so I don't have to sort of think back in my mind of all the actions council took on that, is incorporating the same language in there about the council look back, because there is still that requirement that we would have to see it. I don't want to have the sense that it's a go on the full without council seeing it again. While I'm comfortable with the full bonds being issued, I want to have some of that language in there about a look back at the council before it's actually authorized to be spent.
Well, I'll work with Mr. LeCondre and Mr. Davenport and Mr. Foster. I know it would be easy enough to put in the staff report. I don't know if the resolution will allow additional languages, because sometimes that's pretty specified. But clearly your ordinance for the budget amendment twice will dictate what staff can and can't do.
If you all can take a look at where it can go. If it can go in the language, great. If not, in the staff report, just so we've got it. My preference is that it can, if there's a wherefore rather than a therefore, it can go in. That would be great. The other piece of information I'd like to get, this has to do with the water system. If we can get some rough estimates on how much cheaper it is going to be to borrow, given that we're going to be utilizing the good faith and credit of the city rather than the water system to obligate. If there's any estimates that we have on how much we're saving in that sense.
They're doing it GO instead of revenue.
Thank you.
One quick question, Joe. I imagine that in today's extremely low interest rate environment, the cost to carry is very little. So funding the whole thing probably doesn't cost that much. It's cheaper to do the one issue. Obviously, in high interest rate environments, you have to start looking for credit arbitrage in order to cover the cost to carry sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, with the low interest environment, you might as well go ahead and do it all at once, as opposed to having to worry about carrying the interest for. And to follow up, Mayor, based on current market conditions, we ran this just a couple of days ago, so it's fairly current. We would expect that the city will get a premium bid on the bond issue, which means you'll get paid a little more than the par amount of the bonds. We're estimating that the actual par amount that will be issued will be in the range of 8.5. That could fluctuate a little bit. So, to your point of under 10 million, again, we're thinking around 8.5 at this juncture.
And then on the Q-Scabs, do we know how that's going to play out yet?
My understanding is that they're going to issue those bonds at the end of November and close sometime in the middle of December. There was some recent back and forth. I think I left you a voicemail on it. I think they're requiring now, instead of, I'm not sure what you applied for, probably 16 or 17-year maturities, but they're now giving you the ability to finance over 19 years. And again, it's effectively zero interest costs. So in those final 2 years, pay with cheaper money. I would say no problem. So.
Richard, do you know if any of those came back with, there was the possibility that they were actually going to be less than zero?
No, I haven't.
From the structure, since we get to keep the escrow account, we put it in, we keep the interest on it.
That's exactly right.
By
That's how you get to
definition,
less than zero.
It's a less than zero. And if they give it 19, we get a little bit more less than zero. It's not much, but it's a little bit.
Yes.
And Mayor, to follow up with Mr. Kalin's comments, my goal is for you not to have to worry about carrying costs long because the needs for City Hall are pretty dramatic, and so we hope to be moving forward on those plans and executing them and spending the money.
Right. Anything else on this, Council?
Mayor, yeah, I do have a question. Could you characterize the current municipal bond market at this point?
Very healthy.
Very healthy?
Yes, it's been a slow year. The market at the beginning of the fall had probably 50% of the volume that we had the prior year, and that just reflects the economic times we're in. Folks are just not doing a lot of projects. There was, if you recall, we've had conversations with you before, and the Q-Scabs are a variant of these. There was a big slug of borrowing at the end of last year before the Build America bond program expired at the end of last year. So a lot of projects that would have gotten done this year got done last year. So volume is down, but it's picked up lately because the real level of interest rates has been so low. A lot of people are taking advantage of refunding opportunities, as you folks are. So just last week was the highest volume week we've had all year, and that supply was very well absorbed by the market. I think we have our friends in Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal to thank for some of this. Not quite like treasuries, but akin to treasuries, municipal bonds are seen as a safe haven, if you will. And that's despite some of the high profile headlines you may have seen about the Harrisburgs in Jefferson County, Alabama. The market has really sort of looked past those as sort of isolated incidents with a story behind them and not reflective of the health of the overall market. So the market remains good. Interest, we've touched historic lows in interest rates on the muni and treasury side repeatedly over the past couple of months. So it's a great time to be in the market. There's a big appetite for bank qualified paper, which we've structured this transaction to be, and so I think you'll do very, very well.
How about over the next 6 months? What should we look for in terms of our planning? Is this a time to consider long-term capital expenditures or not in comparison to other market conditions?
Well, I think that I think that now, given where the level of interest rates are, I think it's a good time to consider if, from a budgetary perspective, if you can swing the cash flow for the additional debt service. I won't be in the business of predicting where interest rates are going. If I knew that, I'd be doing a different job or not working. So, I think that, the news out of the super committee today where they accomplished essentially nothing, and the continued problems in Europe could have an effect on the markets as a whole, not just the municipal market over the next 6 to 8 to 12 months. What that effect is, I don't know. But as it stands right now, if we continue with stability and interest rates stay relatively low, certainly it's a good time to borrow long-term for projects. It's a good time to build things because despite little baby steps, if you will, in the economic recovery, it's gone a little bit more strongly here in our neighborhood, but still contractors are hungry. I think you'll find that if you put projects out to bid, you'll get a high number of bids and you'll get some very competitive bids. So I'm not trying to suggest or urge you to do something that you're not ready to do, but I'm just trying to answer the question.
And vis-a-vis other elements of the market, you see the municipal bond market remaining strong and healthy for the foreseeable future? I mean, the interest rates may go up or down depending on a number of factors, but the municipal bond market vis-a-vis other markets?
You're asking me to go out on a limb and make a prediction on that. I think that absent some sort of external external force acting on markets generally, like Europe, like further downgrades of the U.S. government, leading to actions, wholesale downgrades by rating agencies of local credits, I put those in a basket of unknowns. And another thing I'd put in there is there's been repeated talk of doing away with the tax exemption for municipal bonds altogether and how that would affect the municipal market. Every time it comes up, it really goes nowhere, but it continues to come up. So that's another unknown that could affect the market. But absent sort of those external hands, if you will, those forces, the market has survived and thrived, really, over the course, really since the financial crisis sort of dissipated in late 2008 to mid-2009. The muni market's been very, very solid.
Thank you.
Joe, but I mean, when you say it's healthy, you're just talking about the volume. The fact is, if they're just fundamentally financing, there's no expansion of debt. It's just a restructuring of existing debt. So yes, in terms of volume and turnover and the churning, it may look healthy, but it doesn't mean that the underlying economic forces that determine the actual volume of new debt have changed. That may not have changed much at all.
No, when I speak of healthy, I'm speaking of people are able to get credit. Local governments are able to get credit at market interest rates. So it's not as though the municipal bonds are in a class unto themselves and are being penalized from a credit standpoint. For example, Italian bonds, their yields are above 7% for their 10-year bond. They're being looked at from a credit point of view as a high risk, and therefore the interest rates in which the Italians pay are much, much higher. There are no such issues facing the municipal market. People that want to enter the market, and if they have reasonably good credit, can get credit at market rates. The market is clearing, which is what a healthy market will do, and that's what I really mean by a healthy market. Does that answer your question?
Thanks. I understand your definition, but I think there was a question about whether it meant that the underlying appetite for additional debt from municipalities was going up, and that's, if it's refinancing, the housing market doesn't boom just because you get a lot of refinancing. It's just a restructuring of the existing mortgages. Doesn't mean more homes are sold. I'm just saying that it's a complex question. I can see why, from your point of view, it would be considered to be a healthy market. For what you do, that's what it is. On a broader macroeconomic sense, I don't know what the answer is, but it's not clear to me that the municipal governments are in that much better shape, the ones that can refinance.
Yeah, I was speaking solely of market conditions and not of the health of the underlying borrowers and their optimism about issuing debt. This market, clearly that has been dampened as a result of the continuing weakness in the economy. That being said, we're talking about municipal governments, state and local governments that, with a few possible exceptions, which we've all read about, generally don't go out of business. And you can only defer maintenance needs for so long before they start to catch up to you. And so I think that if we have even a little bit of stability or brightening of the economic picture, I think you'll see governments try to start to address some of those deferred needs in the coming year or so.
Okay. All right. Why don't we move to the IT support service contract? Thank you very much for being here. Thanks.
Good evening, Council. Before I actually start the staff report, I want to acknowledge in attendance we have with us 3 representatives from Intellidyne, which is the firm that I'm recommending for this IT support services contract. Behind me I have Steve Oliveris, the CEO. Next to him is Tony Crescenzo, COO, Chief Operating Officer, and then to his left would be Jamal Matthews, who is currently the on-site IT manager and is proposed to continue in that contract role. They're available this evening if you have any questions as part of my presentation. I also wanted to acknowledge Councilmember Gardner's support during this process. Since she has the IT background at the request of the mayor, I did brief her on our process, our selection process, the contract negotiations and core terms, and also gave her the contract and some background on some of the projects and issues so that she'll have some more detailed information available for comments or your questions. So with that, what I have before you this evening is a recommendation to authorize the city manager to award a 2.5-year contract for the IT support services contracts. This is the operational backbone for the general government and the library of the city. It is separate from the schools except for one small component that I'll mention. Included in that authorization is 1-year additional option renewal periods that would be based solely on successful contract compliance with some surveys for satisfaction of work and metrics, and then also preset cost escalation, which will either be 3.5% or the CPI, which is ever lower at that time when we go past the initial term for renewals. For some background information and what this contract does provide for the city. In 2001, the city switched to an outsourcing as majority of its IT support services instead of maintaining the staff on site, and that is including our network maintenance and desktop support. In 2005, that contract was rebid and awarded to Intellidyne. That was a 5-year contract that expired on December 15th, 2010. As Council will recall, you agreed to a 1-year extension so that I could complete a full IT assessment, which we hired LV Technologies to do, and also at that time, as continues today, the Chief Technology Officer position was vacant, and we wanted to make sure we had a good assessment and make a decision as to which way the IT support services would go for the city before re-awarding that contract or filling the CTO's position. On line 26 of the staff report, you have a brief summary of the IT assessments recommendations as it relates to this component. As you will recall in the summary briefing, they've provided over 50 recommendations over a 4-year strategic plan for us to focus on and implement. But one thing they did recommend is that we continue to outsource this contract because we had more bang for the buck, as it were, than by having the staff on site. And you can see some of the items that I've highlighted, but they would include that we have dedicated staff to support the City of Falls Church needs. The contractor provides the expertise. We know how many hours a year we're purchasing. They maintain all the certification and training required. We also get 24/7/36 support, both the on-site and the corporate backbone. And so if a position becomes vacant, the contractor fills it in backbones, that we don't have a vacancy and a gap of services while we go through the recruitment process. In the contract, in the staff report, I have provided you a scope of service and some of the complexities of what this IT contract does. I'll just highlight some of them. It is indeed our 24/7 support for the city functions, whether that's our SCADA and our water systems to make sure we have an ISP out there, and Rodney and Brenda, who you just heard from, can be monitoring the water levels in our tank. to the VEASAN connections out to our police, so when they're on the street, they can connect and check for warrants and status of cars when they pull them over for offenses. It's our wireless, it's our 250 desk stations, it's your library 7 days a week, and the community center rec trek registration. And so it's a whole diversity of things that are very obvious to those that are not until they go down. And it even includes the wireless this evening when it didn't work in Chambers, and I called Jamal up there to reboot it for me when I wasn't successful on the first round. We do have 32 servers. It's our emergency operations centers, 250 phones, a boatload of stuff that you can see online, 70 through 86, and then on the next page. I did want to highlight the RFP procurement process that we did, since this is a very complex and important contract, and I'm proposing an extended term related to this. We did post this on the state's EVA, Electronic Virginia Procurement site, which had over 3,100 firms posted for IT. 17 firms attended our pre-bid meeting. This room was packed. We had 4 firms submit proposals, and you see those firms listed on line 98. I also involved a full evaluation panel that included LBL Technologies again as our technical expertise, since I didn't have a CTO and they had done our assessment. We had a schools rep, communications rep, library rep, our IT committee, so we had an end user, and then I served on the evaluation. We had everybody submit some sealed bids, so when we did the evaluation, we were looking solely at the quality of the proposals first, and after those were scored, then we reviewed the pricing. As we did that consistently throughout the process, and Teledyne was the #1 scored. We then checked references, Duns and Bradstreet, and compared their prices against each other, and Teledyne came out #1. We also did second oral interviews. The contract term, as I mentioned, is for 2.5 years. It's a fixed price, so we know for the next 2.5 years what the dollar amount is. There is one piece that we will be partnering with the schools on, and so this will be sort of our first formal coordinated contract with the schools related to IT. They're purchasing 150 hours off of this contract and contributing $10,000 towards the price of the contract. Before, they were buying system administration hours sort of ad hoc, a la carte, off of the hourly rate, and it was not as cost effective as now the planned approach that we'll have in partnering with the schools for the needs where they can't meet it with their on-site staff. I believe that the term of this contract, although long, is very important for the successful delivery of IT services for a locality. Once you know what the infrastructure, the backbone, and the redundancy is, all the IP and all those configurations is very disruptive to a system to turn it over and start over. Transition between one vendor to another is a good 1.5 to 2, and then probably another couple months before the staff really know all the systems. But I'm also clearly recommending that it would not be extended past the 2.5 years unless it's successful. And Teledyne has proven that to date for the past 6 years, and then also successful price negotiations and authorize if the appropriations are by council per each annual budget process. This contract does end on December 16th of this year, and so if you do not wish to approve it on November 28th, we will need to move into a month-to-month contract extension while we consider what other options council might wish us to do. So with that, staff recommendation is to approve this and forward it to the November 28th meeting. And as I mentioned, and Teledyne is here. Reps, if there's any questions or comments you have of them, and I will defer to any comments that Councilman Gardner might want to add based on her review.
Robin, anything from your review?
There you go.
Need a mic?
I just want to say that I think Cindy and team were very thorough on this, and I think she brought up a number of points that I thought you all might ask. Hopefully her having the answers prepared prepared might have answered some questions you might have had in your head prior to what we're about to talk about. But, you know, I think the process went well. It sounds like they looked at all the right considerations that they would need to look at. I did have questions about the length of the contract, because 10 years is a long time, but they are option years, and there's always an opportunity after the first 2.5 years to recompete if we recognize that it's not, the services aren't provided or not what we expect. There's also benchmarks built in, and there's also service level agreements built in to the contract, which are key to getting us what we want. So with all that, I think the process and the outcome is something I'd be looking for.
Thanks, Robin. Questions by council members? David and then Johanna.
It's a question for Cindy and for Councilmember Gardner. Have you looked at other municipalities and our costs versus other municipalities our size? Can we benchmark the overall cost that way? And then compare the cost of this to, you'd probably be able to have 4 full-time employees for this price. So tell me why we're going this way as opposed to that way.
As part of last year's budget process, I did provide some benchmarking, and it's also part of the one-year extension. Council requested that. So for initial response, if you turn to line 45 of the staff report, I will just point you to the Gartner Group study 2009 that kind of looked at a benchmarking of organizations and how you should IT staff. It is just one of the benchmarks, but using their methodology and the size of the organization and the number of staff, sort of just who has desktops, and then you assume that you have some infrastructure backing those up. Based on that, the city would need to be staffing 11 full-time equivalents. What we currently have is the 1 CTO position, the 3 contract employees, and one thing I'll have to correct before Monday's staff report, I forgot to list our 1 library automation application specialist. So there's 1 other staff, but clearly we're not at 11. When I did the benchmarking comparison to the other Northern Virginia jurisdictions, it's a little challenging, and I still have that chart. It's a little hard because it's apples and oranges. A lot of the localities have economy of scales, but what you see with most of the smaller localities is they're outsourcing it and leveraging it, because just 4 staff here would not give me the depth of bench that I'm getting from Intellidyne's corporate. It would cost more than the $531,000 to get the same value. Your larger localities, Fairfax County, Arlington, Loudoun, they staff it. When I was in Loudoun, I had a IT department of 60 employees, and they still had contract services for 3 third-party vendors. So when I did that comparison, I would say this stacks up very well. I believe we're getting economy of scale that we can achieve with on-site staff, and then we get the expertise that Intellidyne needs to maintain their employee certification and skill sets. As the technology in the world changes, as we look at cloud and new virtualization, VMware, all of that stuff, we're not stagnant depending on us having to train staff. I don't have a training budget in the IT department, for example. Did that cover it for you, Mr. Snyder?
It does. And
Yeah,
Councilmember
I will concur. The fact of the matter is, 4 FTE become stagnant, don't have surge capability, and don't cover 24/7. And the fact that when you outsource, you might have 2 people working regularly, but you always have that capability of bringing in somebody for 40 hours to do something specific that you would not have if you used just 4 FTE. So the capabilities and the depth and the breadth of the knowledge that you get from outsourcing in this particular arena covers a lot of the need that we would want.
And I didn't highlight in much detail, but we do have 150 hours of web support hours that will support communications department to enhance the website and the CFC net. So we're not hiring a webmaster to sit here till we need them. We'll reach back into Intellidyne's web unit to provide those support for us, but it's a dedicated person, so we don't have to train somebody each time. They've committed who that personnel is. And the same is for 400 hours of systems administration. Up to 150 of that will be dedicated to school needs, and the other will be for the city. So we have that surge space for a lot of projects, which I did provide Ms. Gardner a copy of our current projects. We have 47 active projects right now that Intellidyne's working on, whether it's fingerprinting for the police department or invoice cloud and e-commerce for the treasurer, for example.
This question is either for Wyatt or for Cindy. Actually, I have two procedural questions, and then if other council members want to talk, because I've got also some very specific questions. We've recently had conversations on council with regard to contractual relationships we are entering into, either with nonprofit organizations to provide childcare, or in this particular organization, to provide IT services. What is the procedure that the city uses on a regular basis to assure itself of its partners' regular financial viability? I mean, is there sort of an annual document that a for-profit submits as a result of, I don't know what that is. I only work in the nonprofit world. That might be my first question, so just a sort of an annual viability check. And then also, is there an annual review of conflict of interest? Do we do this on a regular basis? Those are my broad procedural questions.
Cindy to answer the question
for this specific contract. In the contract that we've negotiated with Intellidyne, they will annually provide us an independent audit of their financial within 120 days of the close of their books, and also have a requirement to notify us immediately upon notification if their rating, for example, with Duns & Bradstreet were to change and go down. So we have those two protections in there. And then we did conduct a conflict of interest in this particular case. I'll defer to any broader.
Let me refer to Richard, who oversees purchasing.
Well, in general, they're required, when we do an RFP, to submit that they are a viable business in Virginia. I do review the financials as well as the D&B report.
Other council members? A few questions. First of all, with the escalation clause that's built in, 3.5 or CIP, whichever is lower. Robin, you may be able to address this as well, so feel free to jump in. Is that generally standard in what we're seeing in the industry with these types of contracts?
It is consistent for what this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very standard.
That it would be 3.5 or CIP.
Well, it used to be higher than that. This is a good market right now. That's actually a much better deal than a couple of years ago.
Okay, great. I didn't have a sense of it, so.
And that is standard for the city's issuance RFP. It's also standard in the field, but that is a consistent approach we take.
And then, Robin, I think I heard you say that it can be rebid after 2 years. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah, there's the additional option.
2.5?
2.5. Yeah, because after that, they're option years. So if we're not happy with service after that, we can cancel the option years.
Okay, got it. But that wasn't clear, so thanks for clarifying that. And then my final question is, we had gotten a series of recommendations, some of it which, for example, touched on going to the cloud, et cetera, from the Long Range Financial Working Group. Were those considered as part of scoping this out?
They were, in terms of a specific component of the Intellidyne technical proposal, is to look at what their innovative approaches are and how they stay current with technology, and what functions and groups they have within their corporate structure to ensure that we have those options. The Long Range Financial Working Group's recommendations were actually fed into the LBL's technology assessment because it was concurrent when we received them. And so some of those concepts are rolled into our 50 recommendations that Intellidyne, as part of this contract, would be helping us to execute. Some of them are governance and would be the chief technology officer's responsibility, but some of them ultimately result in implementation.
And some of those were actually hardware and software related, not services, right?
Correct. And so the Intellidyne contracts helps us execute those hardware implementations. I have separate money in the IT budget where I might buy the server, but it's Intellidyne, like right now we're converting our Munis, our financial system, to a SQL base, and Teledyne was the one that purchased the server and installed the software and got it ready for us to do that stand-up. Clearly, LBL was recommending before we do some of the cloud and the other things that the long-range members did is we needed to look at consolidation, virtualization, VM, and get a lot of things in place, and then do a good requirements testing to make sure that the security and the redundancy were there before we launch into programs. There are some, like email, we archive off right now in the cloud. We're having some service issues, so you need to make sure you have good SLAs, as Ms. Gardner mentioned, for this contract. Others, like our financial, we might want not to do that to the latter part and really seriously consider before we have all our financial stuff out there. Because if it's dependent on an internet service provider and the internet service provider goes down, you shut down your functioning unless you have good redundancy. So bottom line is we're considering all of that, and I do have innovation components and initiatives built into this contract.
And my only comment would be if we can just make it clear that it can be rebid after, I guess it would be 2.5 years.
Yeah, and if I could be clear, if just drawing yourself to the motion on the page 1, it says for initial 2.5 contract term, not to exceed the dollar amount there, and for up to 8 one-year renewal terms. Those are options.
It's always subject to appropriations.
And it's always subject to appropriations and contract compliance. But my recommendation is not to go out of the gate planning in 2.5 years to bid. That's always the city's option. But having done the acting CTO for the last 1.5 years, the complexities of our infrastructure, to do that in 2.5 years would slow down the operations of this organization. I believe we're firmly making some forward progress right now, and I want to keep that going forward. So it is always an option, but it's not my recommendation in 2.5 years we put an RFP out in the street unless we have a contract issue that I can't resolve the dispute on.
Or if you think there's a contractor that can do it for less that comes in or something's happening. I just think that we sort of went through this drill with health, I think it was the health plan, and realized once we pushed on that and put that out to bid, even though that was complicated and had all kinds of things to do with compensation, which is a tough nut, there was a lot of cost savings. So I understand, but we got to balance some of that out with potential cost savings if things change.
And I do believe that when you have a potential for a long-term benefit for a business partner, they factored that, and Teledyne factored that into the price they gave us.
You don't be standing at the altar and saying you already put something on WillMatch.com. I mean, I'm sure we'll get paid on both sides.
Yeah. As part of the procurement process.
I've never heard a contract put out that way. Thanks, Ron.
Your contract's extended.
It's definitely not the place I want to be. During the proposal process, the 17 bidders, we had questions of what the budget was and the contract was, and so clearly people knew what the city's financial limitations were. And one of the bidders was actually $300,000 over our budget. So I do believe with what this proposal was and the ultimate negotiation down, which this contract award is lower than the initial proposal, that is a good cost-benefit analysis for the city at this point.
Okay. Anything else, Council? Johanna?
I had 2 specific questions. One, I presume that everything, all the hardware and software is backed up someplace remote, off-site, that none of this is dependent on on-site. There's redundant systems throughout the country, right?
There's a variety of an answer to that. It's not 100%. A lot of the core things are, and we need to work for it. The tapes are off-site. We have some NetApps redundancy in Merrifield. Munis is off-site, but not 100% of everything is yet, and we don't have a complete redundancy. So we're working on it.
Is that part of this contract?
Yes.
Okay. And then the second is, is it possible for me to see, you've described the scope of work, but drill down into the budget specificity? It would be interesting for me to see actually what constitutes the 1.5 million.
I'm willing to show that to you, and
Yeah.
Teledyne has marked it as proprietary, so
Okay.
it cannot be released. They have allowed me, for example, to show it to Councilman Gardner. You just need to come visit me. It does
Okay,
not leave.
fine. Okay, thanks.
All right. Anything else by council before Wyatt? Wyatt?
Since we are at the altar, I did want to just say one thing. In Teledyne, we're a organization of first responders, and so when there are bad things happening, those are our busiest days. And in Teledyne, when we put this out to bid, and we did switch our vendors 6 years ago, and went with Teledyne, we were real clear with that with them, and they've always responded, whether it's at midnight because we've had power outages and our police CAD system is going down, they're here. When it's 20 inches of snow on the ground, blizzard, we need them here, they're here. And they've always had that type of culture which matches our own, and I think that's very helpful to us. We rely on you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Cindy, for your work on getting this done. And Ms. Gardner, thank you for looking at the issues as well.
So, Ms. Berry, if you want to look at that before next Monday, just let me know and we can work on a time.
I've had one council, or several council members now, including myself, ask for a very quick break. So why don't we take till let's get together again and move on to we are on to the FY13 budget guidance. So I think the starting point in this was to try to do the similar work that we did last year. So Wyatt, if you want to go ahead and frame some of the policy issues, and we can start providing some guidance.
I would just start by saying I did think that budget guidance was very helpful last year. I think it's very good for the manager and the council to have this discussion at the beginning of the process to make sure that we're on the same page. It's very difficult to put together a budget when you don't know what some of the basic parameters are in terms of what the elected body's expectations are on key things of revenues and major initiatives. The way this is broken out is we have the revenue guidance, and then we have a couple of issues on the expenditure side. And the focus is on the capital, to lay out some of the expectations on capital, a statement on compensation, a statement on pension obligations, and a statement on VRS. First, with respect to revenues, and again, this, just to sort of set the tone for the discussion, this draft is meant to be a discussion draft. This is the council's guidance to the city manager, so we're expecting it to be worked over. So in terms of the bullets, we can, I'm not sure how you'd like to proceed, but we can walk through them one by one, or how would you like to proceed?
Yeah, here's what I would suggest is I think we need to get everybody sort of read it. I think really one of the operating paragraphs or bullets is the one that begins on 63 that we need to just make sure the council's comfortable with, because this is a different model than we had before. Last year the focus was more on the expenditure side. This year it's on the revenue side. So I think that's the first point, and that's a big policy point. Why, if you want to talk a little bit about that, and I'll also have a finance committee talk about it as well.
Okay. Well, November 1st, with the joint meeting with the school board and city council, we went through our preliminary revenue forecast, where we arrived at looking at assessed value growth of about 2.5% and growth in other revenue streams. We came to a figure of approximately 3.8% growth in revenue FY13 over FY12. So this, in that context, this guidance would say present a budget in which any increases in revenues for operating expenses are generated solely by economic growth. In other words, there would not be an increase in the tax rates to meet operating expenditures. Those need to be covered by economic growth, organic growth in our tax base. That's what the Senate stands for.
One of the questions that I had about this is sort of operating expenses. I just wanted to clarify that PAYGO would be factored in as part of operating expenses, in your understanding.
Technically, the way that would shake out is right now in our budget we have a $2.2 million structural surplus for fund balance restoration. We've been modeling that since last spring of dropping back to 1.3. So that 1.3, we anticipate that we will have hit our policy targets by the end of FY12. So that 1.3 can be deployed in a number of different ways. Pay-go, capital reserves, or other sort of one-type expenditure types of things is what I would recommend to the council, that that's how that be deployed, because we have big needs on those areas. That it not be deployed to meet operating expenses.
I just wanted to make sure we were in sync on that.
Yeah.
That you weren't folding that into operating.
Correct.
I mean, my understanding of this is that this is supposed to sort of constrain operating, but yet allow for pay-go. So I didn't want to see things that we would do with pay-go not somehow covered in this or pulled out.
That is correct, and but I have to be frank that that's not clear in this statement. So if we want to clarify that, we should add another statement. We know that because we've already had the discussions about the 1.3 million, but there isn't any specific guidance on how that 1.3 million ought to be treated, other than the fact that we've always modeled it as not going into operating. So
I think that might be good for us to consider.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I'll again go out of turn a little bit here, but you know, my focus this year is going to be, you know, trying to deal within the constraints that we have from an economic growth perspective, and trying to make sure that our operating expenses match that, and really begin to focus on CIP and infrastructure building, which we've neglected to do. So that's sort of where I want to get to in the budget discussions as far as the big drivers, and then we can talk about some of the other points. But that's sort of from a big policy picture where I'd like to go, again, as one council member. So I'd really be interested in getting other views on that too. So what do people think about sort of the bullet? It seems like there's maybe a piece of that missing, which has to do with pay-go and CIP on the 1.3 mil. Thoughts? I'm going to take silence as consensus.
I think it, if I can jump in, I think it merits its own bullet, actually, of a statement that says funds, present a budget in which at least $1.3 million is set aside for pay-go, capital reserves, or other types of capital expenditures, as opposed to operating expenditures. And that's not gracefully phrased, but something along those lines.
And that's beyond what you need to put into fund balance to make sure it's restored, because our projections are we're going to hit that, right?
Yes, it is. However, keep in mind, we had a policy discussion that's yet to be resolved about increasing that reserve. So I think at some point we need to wrap our head around that and decide which direction we're going. If we are going to remain at the 12% target, we're fine. We will achieve that at the end of this fiscal year. All right, and that frees up 1.3 million to be allocated toward any kind of reserve that you want. Currently, it is projected in the 13 budget that you have $95,000 of pay-go. You have $720,000 of capital improvements that have no funding, technically.
Okay, right, let's back that up. So how much pay-go do we have programmed in?
95,000 is what is projected in the 13 budget.
But that's what's in the approved CIP.
Okay, so I guess one way of considering it could be also, when you're factoring this in and building the budget, the 95,000 would be built in to this guidance, and anything else would be other pay-go we could do, for example, with the 1.3.
Exactly.
So you would, with whatever you're operating, and I think this is the point that I was trying to get to, is you would take whatever the growth is, subtract out 95,000, because that's already in the budget based on the CIP, if you will, and then the rest would be for operating expenses, and then the 1.3 we could deploy however we choose to. It could be used for the policy issue that we haven't taken up, which is, keeping above our policy goals, or it could be used to deploy. So I think if we've already talked about deploying 95,000, we may want to consider having that as actually, if you will, the way I'm thinking about it is it's deducted out from whatever the operating budget or the growth would be, and reserved strictly towards paying for that capital as PAYGO.
That's fine.
So however that can be explained in language. Ira?
Thanks. Just two issues which we'll have to develop, I guess, a little later. Point 8 on line 82, obviously competitive and sustainable are a bit in the eye of the beholder. So that obviously will be subject to some further discussion. On 88, this language is fine, but I would like to suggest that we have, not to put in the budget guidance statement, but that we have an understanding that this issue will come for consideration to the council, say mid-January.
That's very doable.
Well, it has to be jointly with the schools. I mean,
Yeah.
this is
Well,
not
that's the
something,
point.
but I would articulate that just to make it clear that we're committed to that. I mean, if this is setting out principle, that's a pretty high-level principle, because saying council options kind of makes it sound like, well, we're going to decide what to do. I'd be happier if we made that clear.
In trying to draft this the right way, we wanted to be careful about not having it appear to be directive to school staff, but that is certainly our intention, and we've been working with the school's finance staff on the beginning on this issue. So that's the way our approach would be intrinsically.
And on that point, Wyatt offered some language, and I had talked to Wyatt about that to add in some language saying, identify and track the issues. I can't remember the precise language, but
Yeah. And I emailed that out to the city council, but the way that phraseology went was to identify current and potential future financial risks to the city stemming from state decisions regarding VRS funding, and provide the council with options, including possibly setting aside funds for future VRS obligations in light of the state's current underfunding of those obligations. And that is the status quo. The state is today currently underfunding its the ARC, and it has been for years. So there is a gap there. But the question is, does the city want to unilaterally do anything about that to protect us against what are pretty easily predictable increases in contribution levels? And I think that's going to be what my direction from this would be, is to present some options on how to do that, or possibly there's some others that we can work with Hunter and Tony on that we haven't thought of that are different than just setting aside money now to meet those other obligations. But so in mid-January, we'd be having a discussion with the council and the school board about those options.
Ira?
That's correct. And to your point, Ron, I mean, clearly it would be much more preferable to have the school board, involved in coming to a mutual agreement on how this would be done. And that would be clearly the first preference. If, however, for some reason, there is a view that it's not a problem, right, for the schools, we still face costs, and then would have to still solve the issue of the identified and quantified shortfalls that we will at one point or other be asked to make up.
Well, we will. Again, the school has the prerogative to set some priorities within their own allocation, and so I want to respect that line and, hopefully come to some mutual discussion on that.
And on that point, I mean, we're trying to set up the joint work session on that. Yeah. So, and I think the language, I feel uncomfortable, directing, and Wyatt, I think, did draft some language that had, city staff working with schools. I really don't, that's the intent, but I don't feel comfortable having something in this language that we're going to pass that directs the schools to do anything.
Right. That was my point.
Yeah. So, and I don't think the language that Wyatt's offered does that. So I'm comfortable with the language that Wyatt's proposed, and I don't think we need to put it into the guidance. Ira's point of our expectation to Wyatt is that would be presented in mid-January. So I'm proposing that we put Wyatt's alternative language in. Are people comfortable with the added language that Wyatt proposed?
Okay.
All right. So why don't we go ahead and add that piece in. If we can just briefly talk about line 85, that's the city and police pension plan. That's where we're doing what we're doing now, right? I mean, that's really not a new point.
That is correct. It's just an affirmation of what the city has always done.
Okay. And the one other piece I was just going to raise to council, Wyatt and I have had some discussion about it. One thing that I think is missing in this guidance is we've done a lot of work about modeling and multi-year budgeting, and it's somehow not captured in the guidance that's provided. I mean, it's the overall theme. I think we understand it. I think certainly the manager understands that it's all supposed to be based on the multi-year work that we do, but somehow it's just optically not there. And I think one of the principles I have, and this is tied in with the expenditures or the revenue, the line 63 part of this is it's all tied in with the work that we've done. So the starting block what did we model, and what has changed and why, and part of our discussions in the budget process would be about that. So I think some language that says something in effect of, the manager shall, as he's developing the budget, shall look and consider the multi-year budget plan that was set forth last year. And obviously, it's not going to be the same one because the numbers have changed, but a clear indication that that's supposed to be part of the work that he does. So he's not just developing a budget out of thin air, but it's grounded in the work that was done before. So, I don't have that language in my head, but.
Not a question, just a comment on the issue of the city's pension plans. I'd just like to say that from my experience and knowledge of various pension plans, the city has been a very good sponsor and has been very rigorous in its application and effort to keep the city's funding at the appropriate levels, and I think it's noteworthy in comparison to other jurisdictions and other experiences.
Others? Robin?
I just have a question. I know that the main objective is to present a budget in which any increases in revenues for operating expenses are generated solely by economic growth. But if you go further on down, it starts talking about all these things that have to be in the budget. And specifically, I'm getting down to the present a budget that provides a level of employee compensation that is competitive within the regional labor market and sustainable over the long term. What's the expectation of Wyatt if our expenses do go over what our revenue projections are? I mean, should he be saying, in order to stay competitive in the market for our employees, it's great that we're basing this on revenue, but we are going to have to do some type of tax increase so that we can afford to pay our staff? I mean, is that an expectation that we're having?
Yeah.
So basically, if it comes between one or the other, if it's just, stay at the revenue and then provide a level of employee compensation, the level of employee compensation loses in the scenario, right? I'm just asking the question. I'm not placing any value on it, but I'm just asking the question. Is that what we're expecting?
Well, I would term it a little bit differently. I think this gives a framework for the discussion, and that there's lots of competing interests, including CIP item, PAYGO, employee compensation, and the city manager is supposed to present a budget that that, you know, it takes all of them into consideration and puts it together. Ultimately, the policy calls are ours, but it's a way of balancing everything out and providing guidance as far as where he's headed.
Well, I guess the question is it, I mean, you know, it starts to read like the charge to the super committee, that we're gonna do this and we're gonna do this, and we know it can't be done. So, I mean, based on some of the projections I've seen, I think we're kind of setting this up that it's not necessarily gonna work, particularly if it's listed at the top of the page. Sometimes people assume this one takes priority over that, and maybe we're all in agreement, no, it's just a wish list, and that's what we want, but maybe it makes more sense to word it along the lines of attempt to present, or present that, you know, or that there's a breakout of something beyond that, so we can analyze how we want to prioritize, because that's what it's going to come down to, and that's always the struggling part. I mean, the way some systems deal with this is they say, present a baseline that shows where we are now, and then see what needs are for each of these things to the extent they increase where you're increasing, and then you prioritize increase, but we're not really.
And I think that's why the modeling may be helpful, because it does capture some
Well,
of that.
it will be. It's just if you read it all right now, I think from the outset we know it is unlikely to be able to achieve all those things. So I guess the question for Wyatt is, do we need more specific guidance or room so that we can see all the options? Or are we saying, maybe what Ms. Gardner was asking is, are we saying we don't want to see any option other than this? Because that's how I kind of would have read this. Not that I'm advocating that, I'm just asking.
I don't have a perfect crystal ball on this, but in seeing and talking with all the other jurisdictions, what my sense is that the city has, over the last 2 years, solved a lot of our special revenue issues, the situs issue, the transfer issue. And so our situation on the expenditure side is going to be pretty similar to what's going on in the region. I think everyone is going to, every jurisdiction here is going to be constrained on the expenditure side for operating budgets. And so, and we will be as well. So I think that that marriage will work. If we do know, just to make sure we're all on the same page on this, though, in terms of on the capital, and specifically with respect to stormwater, what this guidance does lay the foundation for is at least a policy discussion about a dedicated revenue stream for long-term stormwater financial planning and getting traction on some of those stormwater needs. That could be outside of that revenue budget guidance, which is about operating expenses. This is the stormwater is capital expenditures. So what we're talking about specifically is a dedicated fee to fund stormwater of the long haul. That's where, to do that, that's going to be an add-on, and we'll be able to quantify that.
I would see solving the state's pension problems as an add-on too, if that's how some folks read that part of it as well. Because the bullet about doing what we have to, that's a philosophic. I mean, if we're going to prioritize that, that's
one
the
at a
issue.
time. One at a time.
Yeah, that's where we're going to need to flesh out some strategies, and I think one big, well, there are some options on it, and you know, the 1.3 million that we've talked about could be, you know, in terms of setting aside funds for reserves, that could be one of the reserves
that
that
dovetails with the capital discussion.
Exactly. So there's where you have real competing pulls on scarce resources.
I have to take issue on. It's not solving the state's problem. It's our problem. The CFO said the state has no obligation at all to fund any of the shortfalls. The decisions are made in Richmond, and we have to pay. It is not their problem. In fact, it is precisely almost 100% our problem. And that's the issue that we need to confront, because the city has a shortfall, an unfunded amount of $30 million, according to the CFO.
I'm not arguing underlying that there's a systemic issue. What I'm saying is the philosophical question is if we want to start with this model that we're anticipating everything based on growth, with the exception of capital and this, it sounds like we're kind of in that ballpark. But I view this as it may be an add-on we want to add on, but I think we have to have that discussion about do we add on for that problem or not, as opposed to, gosh, we can't give salary increases this year and we have to, increase 10 other
Right.
things because of that. I mean, you see what I'm saying? I'm seeing it as more of a special situation, not that it doesn't exist, just that it deserves a special look at its own solutions in addition to that.
I think that's sort of the way that this is drafted. I mean, he's supposed to provide options as far as the VRS and the big capital.
He does. It
stormwater.
helps to have this conversation because the way they're written here is sort of equal bullet points mixed up. Someone could come back 10 meetings from now and say, in the heat of when we're getting into the real nitty gritty, and say, well, we have a budget guidance by God that lists all these things, and we expected all this. And I was asking the same question Robin was, to make it clear that a couple of these things are some real special considerations.
Right, but at the same time, I mean, I think it's also up to council, and I think this is the flexibility that's needed in the guidance. We may see, stormwater or VRS that they're important. We may need to take action. Let's just take stormwater, and we need to pull back on the budget a little bit and cut somewhere within the budget to make room for stormwater issues. To take on debt service, for example, if we want to expedite something or another. I'm just speaking hypothetically. This guidance doesn't prevent that from happening.
No, the difference
or
is
it
that
can be that it's something totally outside of the
It's the same
operating
reason capital is usually a little bit separate, because you look at something and you've got something you have to get done, but you say, this is in the 5 or 10 year plan, and then you say, here's how much of that carries over to what is operating this year versus that plan continues, as opposed to the year-to-year stuff. And that's why conceptually you usually kind of break the two of them out, even though they're connected by that amount that's coming out of your pocket each year.
I also should say, I don't have a specific number. I mean, this is not for a specific, at this moment, this is part of the stuff that will be developed. All we know is the overall liability, which we can discuss in greater detail, but I don't have a specific number in mind, nor do I have a specific solution. We just need to have ways of addressing it so we don't get a surprise. My concern has been that the state may not come in with its numbers precisely until after the budget discussions are very far along, and we would be stuck with a situation where staff would have to be fired or public services reduced at the last minute because we haven't had an opportunity really to factor all those costs. It would pain me tremendously to have to solve the problem by firing staff. So that's the issue of the problem. That's really to get in front of that type of situation.
Dave?
The way I read this is that, and I think Wyatt said it a minute ago, that I think we're signaling that this is not a time to grow the city employment levels or the general operations, but rather we want to focus on capital, we want to look at compensation levels, and we want to look at other long-term issues such as the pension issue. That's the way I read this guidance. I mean, you can argue over the numbers, but I think we're saying constrain the any growth in the city's sort of numbers of employees and staff. We really want to focus on long-term issues. And I think there's a point here about compensation that we have to stay competitive. So that's the way I sort of read this. Is that, let me turn it over to Wyatt, is that unworkable from your standpoint?
I think it is.
Huh?
Yeah, I think it is. There are department heads who are coming to me.
Sorry, workable or unworkable?
It is workable.
Oh, I heard
yes. There are department heads who believe.
Did you say it's workable?
It is workable.
Okay, that's all I needed to know. You don't need to,
It's workable.
That's fine.
I will say this: there are a lot of.
Oh, yes.
I heard workable.
It was because of the question, and
Sorry.
the answer was yes.
I was formulating my response. There are a lot of departments that could use additional staff, but I think the top priority here is on taking care of the employees that we have to make sure that that workforce is sustainable and is getting what they need to be able to come to work here, and then focusing on the long-term issues. So yes.
That's sort of the way I was kind of looking at all the language. Thanks. All right.
Any other points? All right, so let me try to do a summary, and then council members can add in as well. So new language as to VRS, what Wyatt proposed before, and then doesn't need to go actually in the language, but our expectations would be that that would happen mid-January, and we're continuing to work with the schools on trying to set that joint meeting up, hopefully sometime in mid-December, early January if we can do that. Point 2 is some language that captures what I mentioned about the manager is expected to use the multi-year modeling as he's developing this based on the modeling that was done last year. 3 was working in the PAYGO issues in the bullet that would be 63. However, that can be done elegantly. I can't think of the language right at the current moment. With the notion, without tying it to any numbers specifically, but having the focus be on CIP and infrastructure directly. Wyatt suggested a possible bullet there. So that's the summary that I've got. The one thing I would just point out about storm water, I know that there's going to be options that are provided on how to fund that. One including the option for the creation of a standalone. I can't recall offhand how much we have in CIP that may be debt service oriented right now. Wyatt, that's, as you've heard in the community, that's an important issue. So we don't need to get into a policy discussion about that, but I would hope that you factor that into the operating side as far as debt service. What I would be very disappointed in seeing is something where debt service that we've already built into a CIP and took a lot of time doing that is not being factored into the operating budget baseline, and that being zeroed out and having growth on the city side, if that makes sense. That would not be the intent of where I'm going with this, in order to allow growth on the operating budget by stripping out debt service, for example, on items that are capital that we've already gone 10 rounds on last year. Like, that would not be okay. So, and I don't know how you capture that. It makes it very complicated. Don't want to do that, but it's my intent. So,
if we start with what has been entitled the spring numbers, your debt service is fine.
Last spring's projections.
Included FY13 debt service. Now, if you're...
Because we were going to take on debt, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And stormwater is included.
In that?
Yes.
Okay. So you could still do all that with what I said?
Exactly.
Without trying to pretend that the debt service is not there to move up the budget?
Yes.
Okay, great. Perfect. So I don't have to worry
we're
about
starting
some
with
weird
the
things
spring
going on.
projections, and we're only showing you changes in terms of what has transpired between spring and now. For instance, we are finalizing the interjurisdictionals. That will change the spring numbers. And as much as I don't want to say it, the numbers for the school district have changed since the spring. Okay.
And I take it some of the things like pensions have changed as well.
We've made those adjustments, yes.
But again, as I mentioned before, there's going to be items that change, like jurisdictional items where we have very little to no control over. I'm sure you guys are dealing the best you can with those contracts. There's others that we have control over. So I'll leave it at that, but there's things that we can control, like operating budgets, and then there's contract items which we have less control over. So, and we'll leave it at that point. That those levers, obviously, that we can control are going to be important. Anything else from council members on this? Are we ready to act, council, on this? I know that we don't have some language based on our discussions tonight yet, but it's scheduled for next Monday. folks ready? Okay.
All right, I'll send out the updated language first thing in the morning, so we need to post the packet by Tuesday evening. So if you can look on your emails and give me feedback on the language that I send out.
Yeah, and given the timing, council, I mean, this is an important issue, so, you know, if we need to make language changes between tomorrow and Monday,
yeah,
we can do that and issue new guidance. I think this is important, that we don't want to jam people up. Okay.
Right.
So, it sounds like we've got consensus with the changes that we were talking about. All right, thank you, council, on that. Okay, we are on to the ledge packet.
Okay, council, what you have before you is...
Before you get started, one point that I'll make, even though we're not going to be voting on schools, one of the proposals that the schools had about higher education, I'm just not going to speak on that particular issue. Not that there's a direct conflict, but I'm not going to get into that one item.
Okay, the draft ledge program is before you this evening for consideration. I thought I'd give you a highlight of sort of the thought process that went into it, and some of the community input that you all received. I am proposing council consider adoption of the legislation program on Monday the 28th, because the pre-filing deadline for the General Assembly is December 5th, and so this will be your last council meeting for action before that deadline. That is relevant mainly to one of the charter items. At this current point, this ledge program is not proposing city initiatives on bills for the things outside of the charter. Next Monday, as per our tradition, the delegation, your senator and delegate, have been invited to join us. And the delegate has confirmed, and I've been playing email and phone tag with Senator Sasselaws, but I am anticipating he'll be joining us for his first annual official legislative meeting with us. The ledge program is built in the same format as previous, with priority, regional, and support positions. This year we got a lot of input from the Electoral Board, the League of Women Voters, Environmental Services Council, and the Library Board of Trustees as formal positions. Those have been incorporated by reference into the legislation program, and I am recommending support of those positions. I will note that on line 385 I have a typo from cutting and paste because it still says Electoral Board instead of Library Board of Trustees, which will be corrected before Monday. As the mayor alluded to, this year the position of the school board's legislative program is different. Historically, they've adopted it by the time council acts, and so we've reviewed, and council has historically included it by reference. They have not adopted it, and so it's not included in your ledge program for formal action as part of the resolution. I did include the draft in your staff report just so you can see the issues they are looking at, because clearly unfunded mandates and insufficient state funding in VRS is a position that the school board has also been looking at as their ledge program. I am recommending inclusion by reference, in addition to our local items, the Virginia Municipal League, the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and the regional commission's positions, which we also have done historically. The regional commissions, unfortunately, is still in draft. I'd hope to have it for this evening, but it looks like I won't have it till tomorrow. I hope to have it in your packet. Those positions are consistent with the regional ones that are in here, and I don't anticipate any issue, but I'll be able to confirm that for you on Monday. The transportation ones from both the commission and the authority are very consistent to the ones council has adopted in past years. The two things that are different in this year's legislation program would be that we will have charter amendments, which we haven't had in a couple years, and the language for the election charter I included in line 42 and called out the next steps. This ledge program does not have a position that you would be taking a vote on the voter referendum, because obviously the voters have spoken and that action's been taken. This is simply your endorsement of ensuring that the staff and the General Assembly process the charter amendment as was the outcome of the voter referendum. I also have referenced in here the resolution that's a separate item for your consideration tonight on Monday, the change of charter for nominations of council by petition. If that resolution would be approved.
Dave and then Ira.
Yes, I think this is a good package, including both charter changes, and I think there are 3 areas which I'm interested, though, in pursuing and wondering about. First of all, in either the federal or state packages, funding to meet Chesapeake Bay requirements. In either the state or federal packages, stormwater funding. And the third issue would be something on pensions.
You mean VRS?
Yeah, calling on the state. Return a little of the tax money back to Northern Virginia.
Yeah. And Cindy, you may want to work with the schools on that in their packet as well.
Yeah, the schools do have that on theirs, and since we're not adopting it by reference, it's not here. You know, the state funding local partnership and the state aid to localities indirectly refer to that because it's dealing with our unfunded mandates historically across the board, but it doesn't call out VRS specifically. So if council would like something on that, I could amend that and add it for Monday.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If you can alert the schools to that, just, again, in partnership, I don't want to get too far ahead of them.
Be glad to.
I don't see why they, but they can speak to it if they have an issue. But let's coordinate with them. Ira?
Actually, the question was answered. We're going to discuss this separately.
Mike.
We'll be discussing this separately.
Yeah.
Mayor, if I could, for the VRS position, do you want that as a priority or a support position, just so I place it in the legislative program to your priority?
Well, support
We
would
have a
mean what?
is we kind of monitor the legislation that's out there and don't push it as hard. If it's under the priority, it'll be the ones that I watch for bills and try to
Well, I think
further
it would be consistent to be priority because of the guidance that we give Wyatt or are going to be taking up. So.
That was my assumption, but it's not
Yeah,
always
no, it's
safe
always
to do
good to
that. I
check
wanted
in.
to confirm.
I had a question. Just again, I don't want there to be confusion on the issue of the charter change about the election date. I mean, that's something that has to go forward, et cetera. So if the staff report can somehow capture that, it's, you know, I don't see the council needing to do anything further. So I don't want it to be misinterpreted that somehow this needs to get done in order for this to go forward. So I'm not sure if it even makes sense to have it in our legislative packet if we are required to make sure it goes forward via both the clerk and also the registrar's office.
Wyatt and I actually sort of had this conversation. On one hand, it has to go forward, and there's no doubt, and it will. What helps is to have a consolidated legislative program when our senator and delegate are going to be working with 3,000 bills. It's just in one place, and I can keep their focus, and I can work with their legislative aides to know that I need to be notified of the charter meetings and stuff because it's all consolidated. So I would request we keep it here, but I can enhance the language for it to be clear that council is not acting on whether the election date changes.
Yeah, I mean,
Council's just ensuring that we want our General Assembly members to support the charter amendment that's being forwarded, because it still has to be enacted and adopted by the General Assembly.
And I think that's important enough to call out in the resolution if need be. And the other one, just focusing in on one, and this was I think a question that is this is on line 277. This is on the FOIA. I think Cindy, this is one where you wanted actually council's view on it.
Yes, sir.
I don't think I understand what it's supposed to do.
Well, over the last year, we've had a lot of conversations in two areas. One, not necessarily for regular council meetings, but for work sessions and committee meetings, there's been the desire to call in if you have a quorum and they're all physically located here, but one of the members can't, can they call in and participate? And the FOIA is real clear, and the city attorney has opined that you may not, unless there's an emergency, snow, or the person has an emergency, and there's some nuances to that code. So one of this would be
I
whether
see.
you wanted to pursue that. Other localities have talked about that. I know Alexandria was considered maybe just for boards and commissions, but this could be broader, because you all have had many committee members, and I'll get a question, I can't come, can I call in? And the answer is no.
Right.
The other is the whole lack of clarity and the lack of FOIA being current with technology. And so you get the do not reply all to these emails, and you can't have a dialogue. So it's not to reduce transparency, but to try to get FOIA to allow you to utilize technology. So it's just a question of whether you wanted a position. I'm not recommending we initiate a bill. The FOIA council is pretty narrow in how they want to proceed, but I think there is movements, albeit slowly, for consideration in Richmond to look at FOIA and technology. So
I think that makes sense.
Well, it's one of those classic areas that they could at least have a task force to look into what could be done to facilitate the changes, not just now, but for new technologies that are going to come. Because right now it's sort of the Wild West, which is why you've got a lot of cases out there going back and forth on some of these things, and some of it's open to interpretation. So it would be nicer to have some better guidance. I mean, the corporate standard in the legal world, the attorneys here know this, is as long as everybody can see and hear, you don't have to see, as long as you can hear each other simultaneously, you're allowed to do anything you would do in a meeting by, and that's true in Delaware and almost every other state. And there's a strong argument to be made that it is much more transparent, because with the technology, you can make sure that everything gets recorded and the public has access to it, as opposed to a meeting where even at a work session, we don't have the same dissemination we have at a council meeting because of the not live broadcasting. You don't transcribe every word. So people who have different disabilities aren't even able to access it the same way. So it provides a lot of possibilities to provide some change for good if somebody would start looking into it at least.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, and just to follow up a little further on that, because for this was a recent, something that I was going to be away and couldn't call in for an economic development committee meeting, and I serve on a state board where we had a meeting where one of our members was not able to physically be there, but there was a quorum in our location in Richmond where he was able to call in. So that's where my assumption came of, well, I should be able to do the exact same thing, and then find out I can't do that. So I think there needs to be some movement on this with the pure fact of the technology that we have and the ability to, from wherever you may be at, to still be able to participate actively in the process. I think we need to catch up with where we are and continue, because it's going to continually evolve of the abilities that we are going to be able to have.
Okay. Anything else by council members? So everybody comfortable on that FOIA position going forward? Okay, great. Thank you, Cindy and Lawrence and Dave, for your work on bringing this one forward.
thank you, council. I'll add the VRS and study under the FOIA, and then clarify to ensure for the charter status.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we are on to the charter amendment. It's labeled as TR 11-46. Lawrence, do you want to speak to this one?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Again, this is a charter amendment to follow up on making every effort to ensure that our city elections maintain their independence from as much of the influence of the political parties as possible. And it's just to codify in our city charter that our city elections are nonpartisan, and has been the tradition of our city to have them that way, and that we plan to continue to strongly push for our elections to be nonpartisan and be nominations done by petition opposed to nominating conventions of political parties.
Council comments on this? What I'll let, I had a conversation with John Foster about this, and I wanted us to explore whether it would make sense. Robin had alluded to ways of also expressing this, I think, such as, endorsements, campaigning, that kind of thing. I know that we were all sort of leery on that on a First Amendment issue. So one of the things I wanted John to take a look at was whether we could expand on the language that's in 47 through 48 by providing some examples to be illustrative, not that they would be binding, but of what the intent is. I know John's has 20 million things going, so I don't know if he's had a chance to react to that yet or not, but I wanted council to know that that's something I'd asked John to take a look at. Ira.
Thank you, Nader. I had another approach, just an idea. Maybe Lawrence can chime in on this, because we've had some corridor conversations regarding the issue of what nonpartisan means. If you don't want to change the charter language, what about sort of a side letter, like we have in finance, where the document, but there's an understanding behind that on how something will be implemented. So for the purposes of the charter change, could be this, but then you could say, for example, you would not have sample ballots, with party endorsement. That you would not have specific party. These are examples of what nonpartisan would mean. You would not have to then complicate this document. You can leave it as it is, and just have an understanding. It could be approved by the council. Whatever. This is what we mean. Should anybody want to know what we mean by nonpartisan? These are examples of what this would be considered.
Since I sort of raised it, I think that makes sense. That's where I was trying to go towards. I mean, that would be one way of doing it.
So can I get some clarification? Are you suggesting we don't amend the charter, but we adopt?
No, keep this clean.
Keep it clean.
Yeah.
With what we have before us, rather than loading it up with.
So you're still taking out, because my immediate concern was the simplest thing to do is simply take out the stuff that says a party can nominate somebody. Right. That just eliminates that from consideration, and getting on by petition, if you just leave that open, I mean, you don't really even have to get into partisan, nonpartisan. It's simply anybody can get on by petition, but it's not a party that is nominating.
We're not just talking about cheating.
I think Ira was reacting to my notion of trying to provide for examples as part of the charter change, but possibly moving that to intent language such as the wherefores, maybe.
Yeah, that was, as I heard Ira, or excuse me, Mr. Kalen, for the record, describe it. I mean, that's what came to my mind, is if council is of the mind to do something like that, is to work it into the recitations in the whereas section. In my experience in local government, you don't typically see what you're describing, Ira, with a side signing statement or that type of thing. Where you do see it is working it into the whereas recitations, and so we could perhaps do something like that.
I mean, that was just an idea, so as not to make this more complicated.
Right.
Johanna, and then Lawrence, and then Ron.
I regrettably have not was not party to a lot of the conversation regarding this resolution, and I may be the lone voice here that doesn't understand why we are trying to solve a problem that I was unaware existed. And so I'm always leery of amending anything if there wasn't a problem to solve in the first place. So, I mean, perhaps everybody felt the need, and Lawrence, you can help me with this one, felt the need that this was such a burning issue that we needed to amend the city charter. I don't see that it is, because once we start these conversations, as people were saying when we get into the whereases, what constitutes, nonpartisan? Does that mean that you cannot then receive funds from, predominantly from a particular party, or that you can't receive funds from out of state, or that the affiliation of the people who fund your campaign are going to be taken into consideration? I mean, I was just unsure about why there was a need to do this, but I'm certainly willing to hear, Lawrence, your thinking on the subject.
John, part of my thing on this was was first part of what you said was because of there was a huge desire by folks who saw changing the elections from May to November that they would become partisan. It's not necessarily, and it's 100% not my intentions to tell folks who they can and can't get contributions from. I don't think that's our particular place to do that. Where I think, and it's completely up to the individual, but me, for example, would not necessarily take funding from, in the pure nonpartisan sense, of a group that openly has a partisan political bent one way or the other. But would of individuals who are potential friends of mine who may be well known as whatever, I have no issue with that, because for me, they're individuals who are supportive of me because of be a Democrat, Republican, that I may have an issue or two that they support, but then ultimately on the state and national level, they may be radically partisan about of whom they vote for purely off of that particular thing. But I think on our level, it doesn't play that big of a role of being things coming from political parties. I think we've all run for office and we've had support from people whom we know are of both political parties. But what my intent is just to make sure that when it comes to folks running for local office, that it does not become a Democrat, well, as much as possible, because you can't keep it from happening. I'll acknowledge that, because that is something that we all know, living in the community in what is Washington, D.C., as much as you try to walk around and not necessarily have a label, some folks are going to just make that assumption. But as much as we can, not necessarily do it within that way and keep what we've been able to do, and continue to allow the wealth of knowledge that we have who are federal employees, that they can still participate actively and potentially run for office in the city.
Well, one of the rules of legislative construction is you read what it says and it means what it says without reading a lot into it. So I'm looking at the reading, and I think we're making this a whole lot more complicated. There's a lot of other talks about where money comes from, or who's supporting whom, or who claims they're supported by a party. That has nothing to do with this amendment. This amendment simply says you don't get on the ballot because somebody had a party convention and nominate you. Right now, the way the law is, the political parties could hold a nominating convention and a primary and go through the same process as all the other partisan elections. That's what it means when it says or under general law, where there are prescriptions in the Virginia Code. The Virginia Code spells out how that works. This change says for these local city and council elections, anybody gets on the ballot by filling out a petition and walking in and handing it in, being however many signatures are required. That's all it says, other than this section at the bottom says intended to ensure nonpartisan elections, which I could live without because it doesn't really mean a whole lot. It's really this first part that matters. It simply says you don't get on the ballot because some party, whether it's any party that exists now or one that exists in the future, or the Greens or the Independents or anyone else, it just says you get on the ballot based on filing a petition. That's all this change says. All the rest of it you really can't control. And you can debate whether it's good or bad, but it's not addressed here as far as the charter change. So all it does is simplify the way you get on the ballots for city council.
But, I'm sorry, but isn't that the way you get on the ballot now?
No, you have a choice, actually. The law, the way the code is written is the political parties could say, we're going to have a nominating convention or a caucus or whatever you can do in Virginia.
This just keeps it very clear that I don't think that that's ever happened.
I don't think a lot of people understand that other option's there, because it doesn't mean necessarily anyone's doing it right now, but they could if the parties organize themselves.
Right.
Ira?
Thanks. Again, Lawrence said it very well. This was an issue that was very important to a lot of people. There was a very active exchange of citizen views and so forth. And one of the concerns was making this partisan. So you can't change what the concerns were. Now, this is one of the ways, and I'm not suggesting that this language be changed or added to, but to address the concerns, which I think Lawrence was trying to do, maybe I'm wrong, Lawrence, would be to just have in the whereases an example or two of the types of things that we would not like to see, to provide an additional layer of comfort that they are going to remain nonpartisan as much as they have been. before, because we don't see ballots, sample ballots with party identifications, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just giving an example. So that, to me, addresses also part of the objective that you had. And I can, this is okay, but I think it would also help for those citizens who are deeply concerned about this becoming partisan. It provides an added layer of comfort, and it doesn't change the way we would present this to the General Assembly.
From a wanting the legislation to stand point of view, John can weigh in on this, but I would suggest you do that as something, well, I understand why you want something separate. The problem is if you muck up elections and have things in there that indicate sort of a bad intent that crosses that First Amendment line, it seems to me that can undermine a change that was otherwise perfectly valid to adopt. Is that a concern, John?
Yeah, that is a concern.
Can you explain that?
Well, yeah, I mean, as we've talked about, what is acceptable under the First Amendment is what this change proposes, which is localities can regulate how candidates get onto the ballot in their local elections. And we would, with this change, be limiting that to petition only. Where it becomes a very big problem under the First Amendment and would probably not pass muster if localities take the next step and start saying, well, political parties cannot endorse candidates, for example. Now, I understand it doesn't say that in here right now, but I know that just in the community, that's been one concern expressed, and I need to be, I know I've said at previous meetings on this issue, and let me reiterate it. We cannot regulate endorsements. We cannot prohibit endorsements. If we try and do that, we are, as Mr. Pepe noted, setting ourselves up to get this declared invalid. And so a concern I have is that doing anything more than what is laid out in this proposal opens the city up to those challenges. And so, my recommendation is to go ahead and vote it up or down as is. I mean, I'm hearing what you all are suggesting with respect to intent statements, and I can go back and look at that. But I would note to council starting at line 20, it does talk about it as the intent of city council to preserve nonpartisan elections for city council by amending the charter as stated in this resolution. So I think that gets us to the intent statement that is a concern for the council. Anyway.
Right.
Ira?
Do you have any suggestions how the concern or the comfort can be provided without getting into First Amendment issues? Again, forgive the constant repetition, but I'm not suggesting that this be changed. I didn't even suggest the whereases.
Right.
That was somebody else's suggestion.
Right.
Okay? I just want to have something on what we were thinking nonpartisan meant. It's not legally binding, but someone says, well, give me an example. What is it you think is crossing the line? Well, here are some ideas. It wouldn't have any force of law. It just would be examples of what partisan behavior might be.
Well, I mean, one way that it could be done that would not raise problems with, I think, with the validity of the changes. For example, an individual member of council could, in his statement in support of the motion to approve the resolution, talk about what he or she hopes to see this accomplish. That is just the individual position of the council member. It is not the position of the body as a whole. And that's one way it's been done in the past in other situations.
No value.
Why don't we do this? It sounds like there's general consensus, dare I say, about the actual text, which would be the therefore section. John, if you can, and I know you and I batted a variety of ways of capturing a little bit more meat to the intent. If you can work some language out that you don't think puts additional risk to the city, but gets to Ira's point of trying to express, because there's been a lot of discussion about, well, what is nonpartisan mean, and what types of things show that. I think Ira gave one example of like sample balloting as being one. So if you can figure out a way of capturing some of that, whether it's with examples or further describing what we mean by that, that may be helpful in some, illustrative, not exclusive examples of that, just to put a little bit more flavor into that without crossing over the risk threshold.
Some jurisdictions make it very clear that party affiliation is not listed on the ballot, and sometimes that's a direct way to state that.
I think we had, and that was, I think we had that.
That's at its core the definition of nonpartisan once you get into the ballot box, and so I don't know if that's somewhere else in our code or something that needs to be articulated
I think
here.
that's that would remain in the code.
But you could, if you wanted to clarify what you're saying, one way you could do it would be to make a reference to that, which probably solves 90 out of 100 of those concerns of the things that happen outside, inside at the ballot box level. The concern is you want to narrow it as possible to not provide grounds for someone to throw, speaking as someone who spends his time in court trying to throw things out when they're not going your way. Sometimes the less said, the better, and you want to target it as directly as possible to not provide fodder for that.
But John, just on the point, the no labels still would remain in the city charter. This doesn't do anything to that, right?
No, but I'm just saying that's a way you
State
could.
code, I believe, that you can't.
Well, I think it's also in the charter.
Maybe in ours too, but I know the
That,
state.
that's your definition of nonpartisan at its core.
If we can work on that and try to balance this out, and John, just so as far as circling back with litigation issues, since we're in an open session right now, there are other localities that have adopted this already as we're proposing.
Yes, statewide. There are several that have adopted the language verbatim to this or very similar.
Okay, so then it should be, if we're trying to do just a little bit more to offer some flavor of what we're trying to capture in a whereas it's not part of the legislation per se, is it fair to say that we're not going to undermine ourselves too badly?
Depends on what the little bit more is.
Well, that's for you to figure
I
out,
understand.
right?
And so I'll work on that between now and next Monday and get some language put together.
Great.
I would just say that there's broad-based community support for the substance of this, and I don't, even though I might want more, I think we need to be careful.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's consensus on not trying to actually make the addition to anything in the charter. So any additions we would consider would be into a wherefore, if at all. And without causing undue risk to what we're trying to do.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Everybody good? Yeah. So we're on to council comments, and we may need to go into closed session on 2 items, which I know it's getting late. So, and I think they'll be relatively quick. John, Wyatt, on the 2 various items, do you all think that we still need to do that? I think a brief check-in would be good.
Obviously I'll defer to council. I think that on one of the items we could probably wait until next Monday with respect to the water system, but again, I'll defer to you all. And then the other one with respect to the property that we've been discussing in the EDC.
Yeah, the disposition of real property, there's 2 council members who have not been briefed on that, and that would be the intention to do that, and I think we would do it pretty quickly.
Why don't we take both? Why don't we just close for both items, just so we can have a check-in and move forward? And I think we can do that very quickly. So why don't we go to council comments and schedules, and then move into closed? Any council comments on anything going on? Anything on the calendar?
We received a letter from the Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce regarding a town hall meeting on anti-crime efforts on December 8th. I think we should, both staff and council ought to attend if at all possible. Thank you.
And Wyatt, if you can update us, again, not tonight since we're running a little bit late, but on Monday about our efforts with the previous letter and where things are headed right now.
Yes.
And also the letter from the embassy as well.
Yes.
All right.
And business development issues regarding the Eden Center as well.
Anything else?
And just quickly, I may not be here on the 12th. I have a work conference in Roanoke that I'm going to try to get back up here that evening for the meeting.
Okay. Anything else, council? Okay. And before we go into closed session, as it relates to the post office lot, as I've filed with the clerk before, and as a pure prudential matter, I own property at 243 Gundry Drive, and I can consider the matter as fairly and objectively and in the public interest. And my prudential disclosure is already on file previously, and I'll again file. All right, so upon a motion made by council member
Barry.
and seconded by council member and passed by a voice vote of city council, council went into closed session pursuant to section 2.2-3711A3 of the Code of Virginia to discuss or consider acquisition of real property for public purpose or the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body, to wit, the post office lot, and 2, pursuant to section 2.2-3711A7, consultation with legal counsel and briefing by staff members or consultants pertaining to actual probable litigation where such consultation or briefing in an open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigating posture of the public body, and consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by a public body regarding specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal services by such counsel, that to wit, the water litigation. Mayor Baruch, yes. Vice Mayor Snyder? Councilmember Barry?
Yes.
Councilmember Gardner is absent. Councilmember Kalin?
Yes.
Councilmember Pepe?
Yes.
Councilmember Webb?
Yes.
And we're not going to be conducting anything other than just simply adjourning when we get back.
We're going to go to the steam room.